The outlaws sat around the old barn, plunged in deep thought. Henry, the oldest member, aged 12 and a quarter, had said in a moment of inspiration,
"Let's think of something else to do, something quite different from what we've ever done before."
And the outlaws were thinking. They had engaged in mortal combat with one another. They had cooked strange ingredients over a smoking and reluctant flame with a fine disregard for culinary conventions. They had tracked each other over the countryside with gait and complexions intended to represent those of the aborigines of South America. They had even turned their attention to kidnapping without any striking success, and these occupations had palled. In all its activities, the Society of Outlaws, comprising 4 members, aimed at a simple, unostentatious mode of procedure. In their shrinking from the glare of publicity, they showed an example of unaffected modesty that many other public societies might profitably emulate. The parents of the members were unaware of the very existence of the society. The ill-timed and tactless interference of parents had nipped in the bud many a cherished plan, and by bitter experience the outlaws had learnt that secrecy was their only protection. Owing to the rules and restrictions of an unsympathetic world that orders school hours from 9 to 4, their meetings were confined to half-holidays and occasionally Sunday afternoons. William, the ever-ingenious, made the first suggestion.
"Let's shoot things with bows and arrows, same as real outlaws used to,"
he said.
"What things?"
And
"What bows and arrows?"
said Henry and Ginger simultaneously.
"Oh, anything. Birds and cats and hens and things, and buy bows and arrows. You can buy them in shops." "We could make them,"
said Douglas hopefully.
"Not like you can get them in shops. They'd shoot crooked or something if we made them. They've got to be just so to shoot straight. I saw some in Brooks's window, too, just right, just the same as real outlaws had." "How much?" said the outlaws breathlessly. 5 shillings. Targets for learning on before we begin shooting real things and all." 5 shillings?
breathed Douglas. He might as well have said £5.
"We've not got 5 shillings. Henry's not having any money since he broke their drawing-room window, and Ginger only has 3 a week and has to give collection, and we've not paid for the guinea pig yet, the one that got into Ginger's sister's hat, and she was so mad at it." "Oh, never mind all that," said William scornfully. "We'll just get 5 shillings.
How?
"Well,"
Uncertainly.
"grown-ups can always get money when they want it."
How? Again. William disliked being tied down to details.
"Oh, bazaars and things."
Impatiently.
"Bazaars?"
Exploded Henry.
"Who'd come to a bazaar if we had one? Who would? Just tell me that if you're so clever. Who'd come to it? Besides, you've got to sell things at a bazaar, haven't you? What do we sell? We've got nothing to sell, have we? What's the good of having a bazaar with nothing to sell and no one to buy it? Just tell me that."
Henry always enjoyed scoring off William.
"Well, shows and things,"
said William desperately. There was a moment's silence, then Ginger repeated thoughtfully.
"Shows? We could do a show,"
he said.
"Get animals and things and charge money for looking at them." "Who'd pay it?"
said Henry the doubter.
"Anyone would. You'd pay to see animals, wouldn't you? Real animals. People do at the zoo, don't they? Well, we'll get some animals. That's easy enough, isn't it?"
A neighbouring church clock struck 4, and the meeting was adjourned.
"Well, we'll have a show and get money and buy bows and arrows and shoot things,"
summed up William.
"And we'll arrange the show next week."
William returned home slowly and thoughtfully. He sat on his bed, his hands in his pockets, his brow drawn into a frown, his thoughts wandering in a dreamland of wonderful shows and rare exotic beasts. Suddenly from the next room came a thin sound that gathered volume till it seemed to fill the house like the roaring of a lion, then died gradually away and was followed by silence. But only for a second. It began again. A small whisper that grew louder and louder, became a raucous bellow, then faded slowly away to rise again after a moment's silence. In the next room, William's mother's Aunt Emily was taking her afternoon nap. Aunt Emily had come down a month ago for a week's visit and had not yet referred to the date of her departure. William's father was growing anxious. She was a stout, healthy lady who spent all her time recovering from a slight illness she had had 2 years ago. Her life held 2 occupations, and only 2. These were eating and sleeping. For William, she possessed a subtle but irresistible fascination. Her stature, her appetite, her gloom, added to the fact that she utterly ignored him, attracted him strongly. The tea bell rang, and the sound of the snoring ceased abruptly. This entertainment over, William descended to the dining room, where his father was addressing his mother with some heat.
Is she going to stay here forever, or only for a few years? I'd like to know because...
Perceiving William, he stopped abruptly, and William's mother murmured, "It's so nice to have her here, dear." Then Aunt Emily entered. "Have you slept well, Aunt?"
Slept?
repeated Aunt Emily majestically.
I hardly expected to sleep in my state of health. A little rest is all I can expect.
"Sorry you're no better," said William's father sardonically.
Better?
She repeated again indignantly.
It'll be a long time before I'm better.
She lowered her large, healthy frame into a chair, carefully selected a substantial piece of bread and butter, and attacked it with vigour. "I'm going to the post office after tea," said William's mother. "Would you care to come with me?" Aunt Emily took a large helping of jam.
You hardly expect me to go out in the evening in my state of health, surely. It's years since I went out after tea, and I was at the post office this morning. There were a lot of people there, but they served me first. I suppose they saw I looked ill."
William's father choked suddenly and apologized, but not humbly.
"Though I must say," went on Aunt Emily, "this place does suit me. I think after a few months here I should be a little stronger. Pass the jam, William."
The glance that William's father fixed upon her would have made a stronger woman quail, but Aunt Emily was scraping out the last remnants of the jam and did not notice.
"I'm a bit overtired today, I think," she went on. "I'm so apt to forget how weak I am, and then I overdo it. I'm ready for the cake, William. I just sat out in the sun yesterday afternoon and sat a bit too long and overtired myself. I ought to write letters after tea, but I don't think I have the strength. Another piece of cake, William. I'll go upstairs to rest instead, I think. I hope you'll keep the house quiet. It's so rarely that I can get a bit of sleep."
William's father left the room abruptly. William sat on and watched with fascinated eyes the cake disappear, and finally followed the large, portly figure upstairs and sat down in his room to plan the show, and incidentally listen with a certain thrilled awe for the sounds from next door. The place and time of the show presented no little difficulty. To hold it in the old barn would give away to the world the cherished secret of their meeting place. It was William who suggested his bedroom to be entered not by way of the front door and staircase, but by the less public way of the garden wall and scullery roof. Ever an optimist, he affirmed that no one would see or hear. The choice of a time was limited to Wednesday afternoon, Saturday afternoon, and Sunday. Sunday was at first ruled out as impossible, but there were difficulties about Wednesday afternoon and Saturday afternoon. On Wednesday afternoon, Ginger and Douglas were unwilling and ungraceful pupils at a dancing class. On Saturday afternoon, William's father gardened and would command a view of the garden wall and scullery roof. On these occasions also, Cook and Emma, both of a suspicious turn of mind, would be at large. On Sunday, Cook and Emma went out. William's mother paid a regular weekly visit to an old friend, and William's father spent the afternoon on the sofa, dead to the world. Moreover, as he pointed out to the outlaws, the members of the Sunday school could be waylaid and induced to attend the show, and they would probably be provided with money for collection. The more William thought over it, the more attractive became the idea of a Sunday afternoon, in spite of the superficial difficulties. Therefore, Sunday afternoon was finally chosen. The day was fortunately a fine one, and William and the other outlaws were at work early. William had asked his mother, with an expression of meekness and virtue that ought to have warned her of danger, if he might have just few friends in his room for the afternoon. His mother, glad that her husband should be spared his son's restless company, gave William permission. By 2:30, the exhibits were ready. In a cage by the window sat a white rat painted in faint alternate stripes of blue and pink. This was Douglas's contribution, hand-painted by himself in watercolours. It wore a bewildered expression and occasionally licked its stripes, and then obviously wished it hadn't. Its cage bore a notice printed on cardboard: "Rat from China. Rats are all like this in China." Next came a cat belonging to William's sister, Smuts by name, now imprisoned beneath a basket chair. At the best of times, Smuts was short-tempered, and all its life had cherished a bitter hatred of William. Now, enclosed by its enemy in a prison 2 feet square, its fury knew no bounds. It tore at the basketwork. It flew wildly round and round, scratching, spitting, swearing. Its chair bore the simple and appropriate notice: "Wild Cat." William watched it with honest pride and prayed fervently that its indignation would not abate during the afternoon. Next came a giant composed of Douglas upon Ginger's back, draped in 2 sheets tied tightly round Douglas's neck. This was labelled "Genuine Giant." Ginger was already growing restive. His muffled voice was heard from the folds of the sheets informing the other outlaws that it was a bit thick, and he hadn't known it would be like this, or he wouldn't have done it. And anyway, he was going to change with Douglas half-time, or he'd chuck up the whole thing. The next exhibit was a black fox fur of William's mother's, to which was fortunately attached a head and several feet, and which he had surreptitiously removed from her wardrobe. This had been tied up, stuffed with waste paper, and wired by William till it was, in his eyes, remarkably lifelike. As the legs, even with the assistance of wire, refused to support the body, and the head would only droop sadly to the ground, it was perforce exhibited in a recumbent attitude. It bore marks of sticky fingers and of several side slips of the scissors when William was cutting the wire, but on the whole he was justly proud of it. It bore the striking but untruthful legend: "Bear shot by outlaws in Russia." Next came Blue Dog. This was Henry's fox terrier, generally known as Chips. For Chips the world was very black. Henry's mastermind had scorned his paint box and his watercolours. Henry had borrowed a blue bag and dabbed it liberally over Chips. Chips had, after the first wild, frenzied struggle, offered no resistance. He now sat, a picture of black despair, turning every now and then a melancholy eye upon the still enraged Smuts. But for him, cats and joy and life and fighting were no more. He was abject, shamed, a blue dog. William himself, as showman, was an imposing figure. He was robed in a red dressing gown of his father's that trailed on the ground behind him, and over whose cords in front he stumbled ungracefully as he walked. He had cut a few strands from the fringe of a rug and glued them to his lips to represent moustaches. They fell in 2 straight lines over his mouth. On his head was a tinsel crown once worn by his sister as Fairy Queen. The show had been widely advertised, and all the neighbouring children had been individually canvassed, but under strict orders of secrecy. The threats of what the outlaws would do if their secret were disclosed had kept many a child awake at night. William surveyed the room proudly.
Not a bad show for a penny, I should say. I guess there aren't many like it anyway. Do shut up talking, Ginger. It'll spoil it if folks hear the giant talking out of his stomach. It's Douglas that's got to do the giant's talking. Anyone could see that. I say, they're coming. Look, they're coming. Along the wall.
There was a thin line of children climbing along the wall in single file on all fours.
They ascended the scullery roof and approached the window. These were the first arrivals who had called on their way to Sunday school. Henry took their pennies, and William cleared his throat and began.
White rat from China, ladies and gentlemen, pink and blue striped. All rats is pink and blue striped in China. This is the only genuine China rat in England, brought over from China special last week, just for the show. It lives on China bread and butter, brought over special too.
Wash it, jeered an unbeliever. Just wash it, and let's see it then.
Wash it?
Repeated the showman indignantly.
It's got to be washed. It's washed every morning and night, same as you or me. China rats have got to be washed or they die right off. Washing them don't make no difference to their stripes. Anyone knows that knows anything about China rats, I guess.
He laughed scornfully and turned to Smuts. Smuts had grown used to the basket chair and was settling down for a nap. William crouched down on all fours, ran his fingers along the basket work, and putting his face close to it, gave vent to a malicious howl. Smuts sprang at him, scratching and spitting.
Wild cat,
said William triumphantly.
Look at it. Kill anyone it would if it got out. Spring at their throats it would, and scratch their eyes out with its paws, and bite their necks till its teeth met. If I just moved away that chair, it would spring out at you.
They moved hastily away from the chair.
And I bet some of you would be dead pretty quick. It could have anyone's head right off, biting and scratching, right off, separate from their bodies.
There was an awe-stricken silence. Then,
Gone. It's Smuts. It's your sister's cat.
William laughed as though vastly amused by this idea.
Smuts,
he said, giving a surreptitious kick to the chair that infuriated its occupant still more.
I guess there wouldn't be many of us left in this house if Smuts was like this.
They passed on to the giant.
A giant,
said William, rearranging the tinsel crown, which was slightly too big for him.
Real giant. Look at it. As big as 2 of you put together. How do you think he gets in at doors and things? Has to have everything made special. Look at him walk.
Then in a whisper,
Walk, Ginger.
Ginger took 2 steps forward. Douglas clutched his shoulders anxiously.
Go on,
urged William scornfully.
That's not walking.
The goaded Ginger's voice came up from the giant's middle regions.
If you go on talking at me, I'll drop him. I'm just about sick of it. All right,
said William hastily.
Anyway, it's a giant,
He went on to his audience.
A jolly fine giant.
It's got Douglas's face,
said one of the audience. William was for a moment at a loss.
Well,
William said at last,
a giant's got to have some sort of face, hasn't it? Can't not have a face, can it?
The Russian bear, which had often been seen adorning the shoulders of William's mother and was promptly recognized, was greeted with ribald jeers. But there was no doubt as to the success of the blue dog. Chips advanced deprecatingly, blue head drooping and blue tail between blue legs, making abject apologies for his horrible condition. But Henry had done his work well. They stood around in rapt admiration.
"Blue dog,"
said the showman, walking forward proudly and stumbling violently over the cords of the dressing gown.
"A blue dog,"
he repeated, recovering his balance and removing the tinsel crown from his nose to his brow.
"You never saw a blue dog before, did you? No, and you aren't likely to see one again, neither. It was made special for this show. It's the only blue dog in the world. Folks will be coming from all over the world to see this blue dog, and thrown in a penny show. If it was in the zoo, you'd have to pay a shilling to see it, I bet. It's just luck for you it's here. I guess the folks at the zoo wish they'd got it. 'Tain't many shows have blue dogs. Brown and black and white, but not blue. Why, folks pay money just to see shows of ornery dogs. So you're just lucky to see a blue dog on a dead bear from Russia and a giant and a wild cat and a China rat for just 1 penny.
After each speech, William had to remove from his mouth the rug fringe, which persisted in obeying the force of gravity, rather than William's idea of what a moustache should be.
"It's just paint. Henry's gate's been painted blue,"
said one critic feebly, but on the whole, the outlaws had scored a distinct success in the blue dog. Then, while they stood in silent admiration round the unhappy animal, came a sound from the next door, a gentle sound like the sighing of the wind through the trees. It rose and fell, it rose again and fell again. It increased in volume with each repetition, till at its height it sounded like a wild animal in pain. "What's that?" asked the audience breathlessly. William was slightly uneasy. He was not sure whether this fresh development would add lustre or dishonour to his show.
"Yes,"
he said darkly to gain time.
"What is it? I guess you'd like to know what it is."
"Gone, it's just snoring."
"Snoring?"
repeated William.
"That's not ordinary snoring, it isn't. Just listen, that's all. You couldn't snore like that, I bet, huh?"
They listened, spellbound, to the gentle sound, growing louder and louder, till at its loudest it brought rapt smiles to their faces, then ceasing abruptly, then silence. Then again the gentle sound that grew and grew. William asked Henry in a stage whisper if they oughtn't to charge extra for listening to it. The audience hastily explained that they weren't listening, they just couldn't help hearing. A second batch of sightseers had arrived and were paying their entrance pennies, but the first batch refused to move. William, emboldened by success, opened the door, and they crept out to the landing and listened with ears pressed to the magic door. Henry now did the honours of showman. William stood majestic in his glorious apparel, deep in thought. Then to his face came the faint smile that inspiration brings to her votaries. He ordered the audience back into the showroom and shut the door. Then he took off his shoes and softly and with bated breath opened Aunt Emily's door and peeped within. It was rather a close afternoon, and she lay on her bed on the top of the eiderdown. She had slipped off her skirt so as not to crush it, and she lay in her immense stature in a blouse and striped petticoat, while from her open mouth issued the fascinating sounds. In sleep, Aunt Emily was not beautiful. William thoughtfully, propped up a cushion in the doorway and stood considering the situation. In a few minutes, the showroom was filled with a silent, expectant crowd. In a corner near the door was a new notice. Place for taking off shoes and taking oath of silence. William, after administering the oath of silence to a select party in his most impressive manner, led them shoeless and on tiptoe to the next room. Over Aunt Emily's bed hung another notice. Fat wild woman, talkin' native language. They stood in a hushed, delighted group around her bed. The sounds never ceased, never abated. William only allowed them 2 minutes in the room. They came out reluctantly, paid more money, joined the end of the queue, and re-entered. More and more children came to see the show, but the show now consisted solely of Aunt Emily. The china rat had licked off all its stripes, Smuts was fast asleep, Ginger was sitting down on the seat of a chair, and Douglas on the back of it, and Ginger had insisted at last on air and sight, and had put his head out where the 2 sheets joined. The Russian bear had fallen onto the floor, and no one had picked it up. Chips lay in a disconsolate heap, a victim of acute melancholia, and no one cared for any of these things. Newcomers passed them hurriedly and stood shoeless in the queue outside Aunt Emily's room, eagerly awaiting their turn. Those who came out simply went to the end again to wait for another turn. Many returned home for more money, for Aunt Emily was a penny extra, and each visit after the first a halfpenny. The Sunday school bell pealed forth its summons, but no one left the show. The vicar was depressed that evening. The attendance at Sunday school had been the worst on record. And still Aunt Emily slept and snored with a rapt, silent crowd around her. But William could never rest content. He possessed ambition that would have put many of his elders to shame. He cleared the room and reopened it after a few minutes, during which his clients waited in breathless suspense. When they re-entered, there was a fresh exhibit. William's keen eye had been searching out each detail of the room. On the table by her bed now stood a glass containing teeth that William had discovered on the washstand, and a switch of hair and a toothless comb that William had discovered on the dressing table. These all bore notices. Fat wild woman's teeth. Fat wild woman's hair. Fat wild woman's comb. Were it not that the slightest noise meant instant expulsion from the show, some of their number had already suffered that bitter fate, there would have been no restraining the audience. As it was, they crept in, silent, expectant, thrilled, to watch and listen for the blissful 2 minutes. And Aunt Emily never failed them. Still she slept and snored. They borrowed money recklessly from each other. The poor sold their dearest treasures to the rich, and still they came, again and again, and still Aunt Emily slept and snored. It would be interesting to know how long this would have gone on, had she not, on the top note of a peal that was pure delight to her audience, awakened with a start and glanced round her. At first she thought that the cluster of small boys around her was a dream, especially as they turned and fled precipitately at once. Then she sat up, and her eyes fell upon the table by her bed, the notices, and finally upon the petrified, horror-stricken showman. She sprang up, and seizing him by the shoulders, shook him till his teeth chattered, the tinsel crown fell down encircling ears and nose, and one of the moustaches fell limply at his feet.
"You wicked boy,"
she said as she shook him.
"You wicked, wicked, wicked boy."
He escaped from her grasp and fled to the showroom, where, in sheer self-defence, he moved a table and 3 chairs across the door. The room was empty, except for Henry, the blue dog, and the still sleeping Smuts. All that was left of the giant was the crumpled sheets. Douglas had snatched up his rat as he'd fled. The last of their clients was seen scrambling along the top of the garden wall on all fours with all possible speed. Mechanically, William straightened his crown.
"She's woke," he said. "She's mad wild."
He listened apprehensively for angry footsteps descending the stairs and his father's dread summons, but none came. Aunt Emily could be heard moving about in her room, but that was all. A wild hope came to him that, given a little time, she might forget the incident.
"Let's count the money,"
said Henry at last. They counted.
7 and 6, screamed William. 7 and 6! Jolly good, I should say. And it would only have been about 2 shillings without Aunt Emily, and I thought of her, didn't I? I guess you can all be jolly grateful to me."
"All right," said Henry unkindly.
"I'm not envying you, am I? You're welcome to it when she tells your father."
And William's proud spirits dropped. Then came the opening of the fateful door and heavy steps descending the stairs. William's mother had returned from her weekly visit to her friend. She was placing her umbrella in the stand as Aunt Emily, hatted and coated and carrying a bag, descended. William's father had just awakened from his peaceful Sunday afternoon slumber, and hearing his wife, had come into the hall. Aunt Emily fixed her eye upon him and said,
"Will you be good enough to procure a conveyance? After the indignities to which I have been subjected in this house, I refuse to remain in it a moment longer."
Quivering with indignation, she gave details of the indignities to which she had been subjected. William's mother pleaded, apologized, coaxed. William's father went quietly out to telephone for a taxi. When it arrived, she was still talking in the hall.
"A crowd of vulgar little boys,"
she was saying,
"and horrible, indecent placards all over the room.
Mr. Brown carried her bag down to the cab.
And me in my state of health,"
she said as she followed him. From the cab, she gave her parting shot.
"And if this horrible thing hadn't happened, I might have stayed with you all the winter, and perhaps part of the spring."
William's father wiped his brow with his handkerchief as the cab drove off. "How dreadful," said his wife, but she avoided meeting his eye. It's disgraceful of William," she went on with sudden spirit. "You must speak to him."
"I will," said his father determinedly. "William," he shouted sternly from the hall. William's heart sank.
"She's told,"
he murmured, his last hope gone.
"You better go and get it over,"
advised Henry.
"William,"
repeated the voice still more fiercely. Henry moved nearer the window, prepared for instant flight if the voice's owner should follow it up the stairs.
"Go on,"
he urged.
"He'll only come up for you."
William slowly removed the barricade and descended the stairs. He had remembered to take off the crown and the dressing gown, but his one-sided moustache still hung limply over his mouth. His father was standing in the hall. "What's that horrible thing on your face?" he began.
"Whiskers,"
answered William laconically. His father accepted the explanation.
"Is it true,"
he went on,
"that you actually took your friends into your aunt's room without permission and hung vulgar placards around it?"
William glanced up into his father's face and suddenly took hope. Mr. Brown was no actor.
"Yes,"
he admitted.
It's disgraceful,"
said Mr. Brown.
"Disgraceful. That's all."
But it was not quite all. Something hard and round slipped into William's hand. He ran lightly upstairs.
Hello,
said Henry, surprised.
that's not taken long. What?
William opened his hand and showed something that shone upon his extended palm.
Look,
He said.
crumbs, look!
It was a bright half-crown.
Well, this man found something to make himself invisible.
Said William.
He just kept on mixing things till he found something that made him invisible, and then, well, he just went invisible and had a jolly lot of fun.
It's only a tale, said one of his audience. It never really happened.
Course it really happened,
Said William. He had overheard Robert and Ethel discussing the film The Invisible Man, and had taken for granted that they were discussing an actual historical fact. The idea did not strike William as in any way absurd. William kept a rigorously open mind, and nothing was, in his opinion, too impossible to happen in ordinary life. He had, in fact, always found ordinary life prodigal of miracles.
Course it really happened.
He repeated.
This man just mixed up some things and found they made him invisible. Well, you never know what'll happen when you start mixing things. Stands to reason you don't. People mix certain things and discover...
He paused a moment for thought.
Gas and electricity and such like.
William's general knowledge was somewhat sketchy, but, fortunately for him, so was that of most of his hearers.
And there's lots of things that have never been mixed before,
He continued.
and so no one knows what they'd make if they was mixed. Well, this man just found some things that had never been mixed before, and they made invisibleness. I bet if I went on mixing things and mixing things for a long time, I'd sooner or later find something that would make invisibleness too. Go on, you wouldn't, said a young unbeliever firmly. What do you bet me?
Demanded William.
I don't bet you anything,
Said the young unbeliever cautiously.
I only say you jolly well wouldn't. You wouldn't find anything to make you invisible. Oh, wouldn't I?
Said William.
No, you wouldn't.
Said the young unbeliever. A murmur in the group of children showed that the majority sided with the young unbeliever. William, who had launched his theory half-heartedly, now felt definitely committed to it.
Do you think,
He said with slow, impressive sternness.
that I don't know what I'm talking about?
Yes, said the young unbeliever simply.
Well, now listen to me.
Said William, assuming his best oratorical manner.
I'll try and explain if you'll all kindly listen to me. Suppose I mixed two things together and discovered gas.
You never did, said the young unbeliever.
Never did what?
You never discovered gas.
I never said I did.
Yes, you did.
You said you mixed two things together and discovered gas. Well, prove it. Prove that you discovered gas. I never said I did,
Said William irritably.
I wish you'd listen and stop arguing. There was gas years before you were born, went on the unbeliever passionately. There was gas in Queen Elizabeth's time. I never said there wasn't,
Said William.
and if you don't stop talking and arguing and interrupting, I'll sit on your head.
He assumed his oratorical manner again.
Well, what I mean is that the men what mix things to get gas and electricity and such like didn't know they were going to get them. They just went on mixing and mixing things till they got them. And I bet if you went on mixing and mixing things trying to get invisibleness, you'd get it in the end, same as gas and electricity and such like. I bet I would anyway.
The unbeliever opened his mouth to speak, then meeting William's eye, closed it.
I bet,
Repeated William in the tone of one who tries to convince himself as well as his hearers.
if I went on mixing things long enough, I'd be sure to find something that made invisibleness. All right, do it then,
Said a boy with red hair at the back of the group.
Yes, I jolly well will,
Said William.
and I bet it won't take me long either. I won't mess about with it as long as these people did what found out gas and electricity. Seems to me people take such a jolly long time doing things. Why, they've been messing about climbing Mount Everest for years. I bet I'd have done it straight away. I'd just gone on climbing and climbing till I got there. Same with finding the North Pole.
To hear you talk, said the young unbeliever slowly,
anyone would think you'd made the world. First you say you discovered gas and electricity, and now you say you climbed Mount Everest and found the North Pole.
William laid him carefully on the ground and sat on his head.
Prove it,
Came in muffled tones from beneath him.
prove you found the North Pole. I'm not talking about the North Pole,
said William.
I'm talking about invisibleness.
He addressed his audience again.
I'm telling you that I'm just as likely to discover invisibleness as any of these other people were to discover gas and such like. It was only a sort of chance. They went on mixing things till they got it, and I bet I'd get invisibleness that way, and a jolly sight sooner than what they did. All right, get it,
challenged the boy with red hair.
Yes, I will too. When? This time next week? Yes, you come here this time next week, and I bet I'll have got it all right. Yes, well, we jolly well will, and I bet we'll have a jolly good laugh at you. Oh, will you?
Said William, rising from the unbeliever's head and advancing pugnaciously upon his audience, who retreated before him in good order.
Prove that you discovered the North Pole,
said the unbeliever, feeling his jaw to make quite sure it was not permanently dislocated.
That's all I say. Prove it.
But William was already on his homeward way. He looked grim and earnest and slightly harassed. He had no doubts at all of his power to discover the secret of invisibility, but perhaps a week had been rather a short time to allow himself. He lost no time, however, in starting on his quest. The next morning in the science lesson, instead of contenting himself with a simple experiment prescribed by the science master, he mixed a small quantity of every bottle within range into a test tube. The result was an explosion so loud and impressive that at first he almost thought that he must have achieved his object. But subsequent events proved that he remained visible and tangible, to the enraged science master at all events. His next device was to secrete various chemicals, take them home, and mix them in the privacy of his bedroom. That again resulted in an explosion that brought his mother and father racing upstairs, and events once more proved to him that the experiment had been unsuccessful. He tried other things. He picked various herbs from his mother's herb garden and rubbed himself all over with them. He even stood in the middle of a fairy ring of toadstools, feeling slightly ashamed of himself during the process, and wished for invisibility. All to no effect. So that, by the time the appointed day arrived, he was no longer a scientist following up investigations. He was a conjurer arranging his effects. The evening before the day fixed for the publication of his discovery, he visited the scene of his rash boast and carefully examined the lie of the land. A pond was just near the spot where he had stood, but he decided that that could not be utilized in any way. From the pond ran a narrow fissure, almost too narrow to be called a ditch, that was generally full of water, but that was dry now as the result of a long drought. It was muddy at the bottom and overgrown by nettles and docks and grasses that completely hid the opening. It was not a pleasant place in which to have to spend possibly several hours, but better than the certain loss of prestige that was the alternative. A small crowd of children gathered together at the appointed place. It was larger than the original company to which William had made his boast, for the rumour had spread far and wide, and several old enemies had come, anxious to witness his public discomfiture. The crowd had begun to gather in good time. There was an air of expectancy and excitement over it. Bets were laid for and against William's success. The young unbeliever was in the front, muttering indignantly. Said he discovered gas, said he discovered electricity, said he'd climbed Mount Everest and discovered the North Pole, said he would make himself invisible. Well, prove it, I said to him, and he couldn't.
Seems to think he's made the world.
Suddenly, William's voice came, startling them into silence.
Well, I've done it. All but my shoes. I found I couldn't do leather. I could do everything but leather.
They stared around them, open-mouthed. Then, with a cry of excitement, someone pointed to William's shoes that stood at a convincing angle on the grass.
I say,
Gasped someone.
are you there, William? Course I am,
Replied William's voice.
I had a jolly lot of trouble finding it, but I found it all right in the end. I'm invisible, all right.
A small child in the front of the group began to cry loudly and was removed by an elder sister. Again there was silence, the silence of utter surprise and consternation.
Are you really there, William?
Said a little girl with gratifying admiration in her voice.
I said you'd do it, 'cause you always do things. Are you really there with your feet in your shoes? Course I am,
Said William. The young unbeliever stepped forward and stamped heavily upon one of the shoes. William, who was keeping a lookout through a veil of dock leaves and nettles, let out a convincing howl.
You do that again,
He said angrily.
and I'll give you a jolly good kick.
The crowd withdrew to a respectful distance.
Did it hurt?
Said the unbeliever.
I should jolly well think it did.
Said William.
Try stamping on your own toes and see if it hurts. I didn't feel as though there was a foot in it,
Said the unbeliever, still not quite convinced.
It felt just like an empty shoe. Course it did.
Said William scornfully.
Invisibleness does feel just like emptiness. Didn't you know that? Would you feel it if I hit you? Try it,
Said William darkly.
and see what you get back. Invisibleness makes you 10 times as strong as you are ordinary.
The crowd withdrew yet further, and there was another silence.
How did you do it, William?
Said the little girl admiringly.
I'm jolly well not going to tell you that.
Said William.
You'd all start doing it, and there'd be an awful mess up. Can you make yourself visible again when you want to? Of course I can.
Well, do it now, challenged the unbeliever.
Go on.
Do it now.
No, I jolly well won't.
You can't. That's what it is. You've got yourself invisible, and you can't get yourself back, and you'll starve to death. That's what you'll do.
Oh, William!
Wailed the little girl.
No, I won't.
William assured her.
I jolly well know how to turn myself back. I've practiced it. I can turn myself visible and invisible just when I like. I can go visible and invisible so quick it'd make you dizzy watching me.
Well, do it.
No, I'm not going to bother.
Walk, challenged the unbeliever suddenly. Walk, so we can see your shoes moving. There was only a moment's silence before William replied.
I can't do that. When you're invisible, you're very light. I couldn't move them. I can get out of them and jump about. I'm doing that now. I've got out of them and am jumping about all over the place in my stocking feet. Now I've got in them again and I'm just standing. Now I've got out of them again and I'm jumping about again. I passed just near you then, George. Didn't you feel me?
George paled and shivered.
Well, now I'm going off home to make myself visible. I'm not taking my shoes because they're so heavy when you're invisible. Goodbye. I'm just running off.
So convincing was William's tone that their eyes turned in the direction of his home, as if following his invisible figure. For a few moments they stood, silent and motionless. Then the spell suddenly seemed to be broken, and as one man they fell upon the shoes, examining them minutely inside and out for any traces of William's invisible presence, handling them somewhat gingerly, as if still half prepared for an invisible kick.
Look,
Screamed the little girl excitedly.
they've got his name on. W. Brown. Look, they are his shoes. It must have been him. He was invisible.
William, realizing that they would probably proceed next to explore the surrounding landscape, was making the best of his way along the narrow ditch. It was indeed so narrow that he could hardly drag himself along it. He came upon unexpected muddy pools, and as he had to go face foremost with a snake-like motion, his nose, face, and hair gradually became covered with mud. The ditch turned a corner and ran along the side of a field. It was just when William had rounded the corner that a bright spirit among the little crowd discovered the ditch.
Look, perhaps he's hiding here.
Excitedly, they began to explore it, holding back the grass and dock leaves, probing its depths with sticks.
No, he's not here. He couldn't have got into it either. It's too little. Well, he's not come out, so if he'd been there, he'd be there now.
William hurried on his merry course, trying to get well away before some other bright spirit should suggest following the passage of the narrow ditch. It went round the edge of the field and then dived under a hedge and entered a garden. William was somewhat disconcerted by this, but to emerge from his hiding place or to retreat was now equally impossible. He could hear the excited voices of his late audience as they searched the scene of his mysterious exploit.
He couldn't have been up a tree,
a shrill voice was saying.
Because there aren't any trees, and he couldn't have been in the pond, because he'd have got drowned.
After all, thought William, optimistically as he squirmed along his muddy way, if the ditch went into a garden, it must eventually emerge from the garden. The garden, indeed, would help matters, as it would prevent investigators from following up his trail. Then he would climb out of his hiding place and go quietly home. If he met his investigators on the way, he could tell them that he had now made himself visible again. He would explain the mud that obscured his person as part of the mysterious process necessary for resuming visibility. He made his way slowly and cautiously. Though he could see nothing, the garden seemed to be full of people. He could hear the sound of innumerable voices. He was startled suddenly to hear his mother's voice quite near the edge of his hiding place. "My other son's only 11, she was saying. "How sweet," commented another voice. "Little boys are so sweet, aren't they?" Yes, agreed William's mother without much enthusiasm. William remembered that his mother and Robert and Ethel, his brother and sister, were going to a garden party this afternoon. He had been invited, as the mistress of the house had some nephews staying with her, but Mrs. Brown and William had been equally unwilling for William to accept the invitation. William hated grown-up parties of any sort, and, as even his mother had to admit, did not appear to best advantage at them. He decided to follow the ditch till he came out of the garden, and then he stopped, disconcerted, for the ditch at this point, instead of remaining open to the sky, became a narrow hole that vanished into the ground. William, however, was not to be balked by a little detail like that. He reasoned that the ditch must, sooner or later, emerge from the ground. He would just go underground with it and emerge with it. He proceeded to try to squeeze himself into the muddy hole. He pushed along determinedly for a few inches, then, to his horror, someone suddenly seized his legs. He was dragged out of his hole and out of his ditch. He found himself on the grass at the end of the garden, while 3 boys stared at him, open-mouthed, open-eyed, with amazement. He was certainly a curious object. His entire person was plastered with mud, upon which was superimposed a sort of dressing of leaves and grass. As he sat there panting, his very breath seemed to consist of leaves and mud and grass. His eyes gleamed whitely.
"It's an underground savage,"
the eldest boy said excitedly.
"Didn't I always say they were underground savages? They live right down underneath the earth, and they go about in tunnels. This one was going into his tunnel. We just caught him in time." "He's mine. I saw him first." "Well, you wouldn't have got him without me. I grabbed hold of him first." "I'll fight you for him." Here, don't let's quarrel about him. Let's join at him. We all found him. All right, what'll we do with him? I say, he does look funny, doesn't he?
They stood in silence gazing at William, who was still breathing out mud and grass. William realized that he was in something of a quandary. It would, he felt, be a mistake to reveal his identity and his business in the ditch. The story would spread round the village and shatter forever the legend of his invisibility. Far better pretend to be an underground savage and make his escape at the first opportunity.
He's all over mud,
said the smallest boy, examining William with interest.
All over, every tiny bit of him. I expect they're born like that, underground savages,
said another.
I wonder if he talks. He'll talk in underground savage language if he does. Let's try and get him to, just see what it sounds like.
William was sorely tempted to talk in an underground savage language. He felt that he could have invented one that would have done credit to the whole race of underground savages. But it would have taken time, and there was no time to be lost. At any minute someone might stroll across from the lawn where the visitors were assembled and discover his presence. It might even be his mother, or Robert or Ethel, who would stroll over. He glanced round. There was a thin place in the hedge over there. He might make a bolt for it and scramble through, but he would have to divert his captor's attention. At present they surrounded him.
Can you talk?
One of them said. William shook his head.
He can't talk,
interpreted his interlocutor.
I expect they don't talk, underground savages. I expect they couldn't hear each other down there in all the mud. I expect they just make signs to each other.
What are we going to do with him anyway?
We could sell him to some show or some museum,
said the biggest one vaguely.
I bet we get a jolly lot of money for an underground savage, especially for this one, because the first one that's ever been discovered. Why not keep him and have him for our slave?
Suggested the smallest one.
A pugnacious gleam flickered for a moment behind William's mask of mud. Keep him chained up somewhere and make him work for us, same as people did in olden times. I always thought I'd like a slave. I think it's a pity people ever gave up having them.
Well, we might do that, said the biggest one.
We jolly well have to think about it.
Where are your boys?
Called a clear voice from the lawn.
Quick, let's hide him,
said the eldest.
They'll be coming in a minute. Let's lock him in the coal house. Then when they've all gone, we'll get him out again and have another look at him.
They began to push and pull William towards the coal house. Escape was now quite impossible.
We could make a lot of money letting him out to people as a slave,
said the smallest one.
Or we could keep him for a slave for about a year and then sell him to a show.
Boys!
Summoned the maternal voice a little more imperiously. The boys pushed William unceremoniously into the coal house, shut and bolted the door, and ran off to obey the maternal summons. William tried the door, but the bolt was a strong one. There was a small window, however, above a pile of coal, which looked fairly possible, and William promptly began to climb up to it. After rolling down the pile of coal several times, he managed to get to it, squeeze himself through it, and drop to the ground. He was just making his way to the thin place in the hedge when he heard the sound of voices approaching. The only refuge within reach was a small summer house. He plunged into this and dived beneath the seat. The voices came nearer, and he recognized one of them as Robert's. The other was a girl's. They entered, and William recognized the girl as Robert's latest flame, a platinum blonde with wide blue eyes and a small, prim mouth. "It's a sweet little place, isn't it?" she was saying. "Sweet," agreed Robert, gazing at her ardently. "But goodness, isn't it hot?" "Let me get you an ice," said Robert solicitously. "Well, thanks. That would be jolly. And get one for yourself, too, won't you?" "I won't be a minute," Robert assured her, and departed, leaving the door open. William began to crawl along under the seat towards the door. The girl was gazing dreamily into the distance. He hoped to creep out of the door without her noticing him, and then make his escape. He had reached the door on his hands and knees when he heard a gasp. He turned. The girl was gazing at him, her eyes starting out of her head with horror. For a few seconds the two stared at each other, William's eyes in his mud-encrusted face as horrified as hers. Then she uttered a piercing scream. Like a flash, William vanished out of the door, but he had not time to reach the hedge. Everyone on the lawn was running towards the summer-house, Robert at the head of them, his face white. William had just time to plunge beneath a bush that grew at the back of the summer-house before Robert arrived. From this refuge he could hear all that went on. "What happened?" panted Robert as he ran. "Good heavens, what on earth's happened?" He flung himself into the summer-house just as the girl was gathering her breath for another scream. He looked around. "Good Lord," he said. "I thought you were being murdered."
"I am murdered," she said. "I mean, I'm as good as murdered. I'm as near murdered as anyone could be and yet be alive."
"But what's the matter?" said Robert. "When I heard you scream like that, I thought, well, I thought you were being murdered."
"Anyone would think you were disappointed to find me not," she said irritably. "Don't stand there like that. Why don't you do something?"
"What do you want me to do?"
"Well, if you can't do anything yourself, can't you get help? Do you want us all to be murdered in our beds this very minute?"
"How could we be murdered in our beds when we're not in them?" said Robert, who was also growing rather irritable.
"If that's all you care about me," she said hysterically, "to stand there and watch me being mauled to death by a monster—"
"You aren't being mauled to death by a monster," protested Robert. The others had now come up. "What on earth was it? What's happened?"
"It was the most terrible creature I've ever seen," said the girl. "And Robert here simply doesn't care. He as good as told me that I could be murdered in my bed or mauled to death by monsters before his eyes, for all he cares."
"I never did," said Robert indignantly.
"Well, you acted as if you did. Just stood there saying you thought I'd been murdered and implying that you wished I had been."
"Oh," said Robert, rendered almost speechless by this accusation.
"Yes, but what was it, dear?"
said the hostess soothingly.
"I kept telling Robert what it was, but he simply doesn't care. He just stands there. It was the most awful creature I've ever seen. Just like the Loch Ness Monster."
"You've never seen the Loch Ness Monster," said Robert, who was beginning to wonder what on earth he'd ever seen in the girl.
"How do you know I haven't?"
she snapped.
"Well, I know I haven't, but I've always had a sort of feeling what it was like, and it was just like that, large and muddy and scaly, with a perfectly horrible face."
"But where was it, dear?"
said the hostess.
"Here, in the summer-house. It stood in the doorway and looked at me in the savagest way I've ever been looked at in all my life by wild animals at the zoo. If it had been hungry, it would have eaten me at once. It was that sort of look."
She threw another indignant glance at Robert.
"And he just stands there."
"Well, what else could I do?"
said the goaded Robert.
"So is everyone else just standing here?"
"Never mind her," said someone pacifically. "The poor girl's dreadfully nervous. She must have had a terrible shock. Darling, what sort of creature was it?"
"I keep telling you, but you won't listen. You all just stand there. Simply dreadful, just like the Loch Ness Monster."
Had it webbed feet?
"I don't remember. Yes, it had. I remember now, quite distinctly. Webbed feet, about 6 of them, or more."
Had it a tail, dear?
"Yes, a long tail. The whole thing was enormous, about as big as an elephant, and an awful savage-looking head."
Did it make any sound?
"I don't remember. Yes, I think it growled. An awful blood-curdling sort of growl. The most blood-curdling sound I've ever heard in my life."
She burst suddenly into tears.
"And you all just stand there."
"Look here," said the host. "She's evidently seen something, so we better have a jolly good hunt round the garden. There's a circus over at Hadley, and something may have escaped. A gorilla, or something like that."
"Gorillas haven't webbed feet,"
objected someone. "It's no use arguing over the details," said the host testily. "Let's search the garden. We'd better get sticks, and perhaps the women had better not come, in case there's any real danger." Some women remained to comfort the sobbing heroine, but the rest, not wishing to be out of anything that was going on, set off to help in the search. They went first to the shrubbery, as being the most natural hiding place within reach. No one thought of investigating the bush by the summer-house door. One of the searchers passed a small boy sitting at the bottom of the garden. "You boys had better come along and help too," he said.
"Can't,"
said the small boy.
"We've lost our savage, and I'm guarding his hole so as he can't get back into it."
"Your what?" said the man.
"Our savage. He's a sort of boy, but he's black, and we're going to have him for our slave, but he's escaped."
"Well, let us know if you see any strange animal about, won't you?"
"You bet,"
said the boy. The man passed on. "Are the boys coming to help?" said the host. "No, they've lost their playmate." "What playmate?" "A black boy, they said. They were going to play some game of slaves or something till they lost him." "But there's no black boy living about here." "They said a black boy. I expect the whole thing was just a game." "Oh, I expect so. Well, let's get on with the search." A small child had entered the garden carrying a pair of shoes and demanding to speak to Mrs. Brown. And now Mrs. Brown approached her hostess, looking pale and distraught.
"Do you mind if I go? Look, I'm so sorry about the animal and everything, but I've just heard the most terrible news about my little boy. The children have found his shoes by the pond with no trace of him anywhere. That pond's really dangerous. I've told him over and over again not to go into it. And here are his shoes just by it, which means he must have gone in paddling or something, and—" She took out her handkerchief. "And it shelves so suddenly I simply daren't think what might have happened. And instead of coming to me at once, these stupid children have been playing a silly game that he was invisible, or something equally ridiculous, and wasted hours of precious time. Do you mind if I go at once, my dear? I'll go straight to the police station first."
A large, determined-looking man strode up to the group. "Well, has anyone caught sight of this creature yet?" Before anyone could answer, the smallest boy came up.
"I say,"
he said.
"has anyone seen our savage?"
Mrs. Brown cast a tearful glance round the group.
"I suppose," she said, "that none of you have seen my William this afternoon?"
At that moment, an enterprising youth dived into the bush by the summer-house and emerged holding a small, mud-encrusted figure by its neck.
"It's the monster!"
screamed the girl in the summer-house.
"It's our savage!"
shouted the three boys.
"It's William!"
moaned Mrs. Brown. William read the letter several times with frowning concentration.
"Dear William, we can't come home because we let it to Miss Evesham unfurnished, and we can't get her out, and Mummy and I want to come home, and do you remember when we were turned out because of that bomb? You got us back, and please, William, will you get us back again? Because Mummy and I are both so homesick, and you're so clever, I know you can. Love from Joan."
His feeling of importance at receiving a letter, for his correspondence was a very limited one, was mingled with a feeling of uneasiness. He had heard his parents discussing the situation. He knew that Joan's mother had employed a solicitor to try to evict Miss Evesham, and that the whole power of the law had been unable to accomplish it. Miss Evesham clung grimly to her rights and to Joan's home, refusing all alternative accommodation. In face of this, William found Joan's faith in him touching, but a little embarrassing. True, he had been the instrument of fate in restoring their home to her and her mother on the occasion when they had been ejected for a supposed delayed action bomb, but that was a very difficult matter. Difficulty, however, was always a challenge to William, and he wanted Joan back. He liked Joan. She was quiet and shy, and amenable and dependable, and he was a god in her eyes. The last alone would have endeared her to William, who was a god in very few people's eyes. He had never failed her yet, and to fail in this task she so disconcertingly thrust upon him might be to lose her admiration forever. But he thought of the hatchet-faced, keen-eyed, slit-mouthed solicitor who had visited Miss Evesham in a final effort to eject her and had retired completely routed. How should he, William, succeed where such a man had failed? And yet it would be nice to have Joan and her mother back in place of the obnoxious Miss Evesham. For Miss Evesham was obnoxious. Even Mrs. Brown, notoriously charitable in her judgments, said that she was the most disagreeable woman she had ever met, and her cat, Hector, was, if possible, more unpleasant even than his mistress. He was a black cat with a white muzzle and a villainous expression. He came through the hedge into the Browns' garden and lay in wait for their birds. Mr. Brown was a bird lover. He had a bird bath and a bird table and a tame robin and chaffinch. Or rather, he had the last two before Hector's arrival. Hector made short work of them and of the other birds who had come to regard the Browns' garden as a sanctuary. Mr. Brown wrote an angry letter to Miss Evesham. Miss Evesham replied by informing Mr. Brown that to eat birds was a cat's instinct and that she'd always encouraged Hector to follow his instincts. She added to this a page of complaints about William, whom she accused of taking short cuts through her garden to the detriment of both lawn and flower beds, and of making her head ache with his mouth organ, and of taking pot shots at Hector through the bathroom window. Mr. Brown sternly warned William against any further hostilities. "She's an odious woman, and he's an odious cat," he said, "but we put ourselves entirely in the wrong by that sort of thing. You can chase the creature out of the garden if it comes in, but otherwise you'll leave it alone or you'll have me to deal with." Since then, William had confined himself to chasing the creature out of the garden in as many ways as he could devise, and pulling faces at it over the fence. He had known cats who could be driven to frenzy by this last treatment, but Hector merely gazed back at him with sleepy green eyes. William read the letter again. He would have to think out a plan, but it wouldn't be easy. And there wasn't time even to start thinking it out today, because today was the day on which his air gun was being restored to him by his father after one of its recurrent periods of retirement. The occasion of its retirement had been the breaking of a pane of glass in Miss Milton's greenhouse, and his father had been grimmer than usual over it. "The next time anything of this sort happens, my boy," he had said, "you can say good-bye to it for good. I'm getting tired of these complaints." Today, Ginger was going to call for him, and the two were taking the newly restored air gun out for a morning's exercise.
"It's jolly mean of him to keep taking it away like this,"
said William.
"I get all out of practice. Serve him right if we lose the next war with me not being able to shoot straight. Let's go and practice in your garden."
They practiced in Ginger's garden, but neither Ginger nor William seemed to be able to hit anything they aimed at. Bottles remained unbroken, tins undented.
"It's all his fault,"
said William gloomily.
"He must have messed it up somehow. Just chucked it down anywhere, I expect, and got something bent inside it. Well, it must be that, because it always hits something I'm not aiming at. Hits something about 6 inches away. Stands to reason he's got it bent somewhere."
It was now lunchtime, so the two decided to meet again in the afternoon and work on that theory.
"I bet we find that's it,"
said William.
"If we want to hit anything, we've got to aim about 6 inches to the side of it."
The church clock struck 1 as William sauntered homewards, his air gun under his arm.
"Gosh, I'd better hurry,"
he thought. He was passing Miss Evesham's garden. The short cut through a hole in Miss Evesham's hedge across her garden and over the fence would save time, and he decided to risk it. Miss Evesham, he knew, was not at home. He had seen her waiting at the bus stop to go into Hadley. He scrambled through the hole and began to walk over the lawn. Well, he justified himself, she can't say I'm doing any harm. What's grass for but to be walked on? Suddenly he saw Hector crouching by the edge of the lawn, watching him with a sardonic leer. About 6 inches away from him was a rose pole. I bet if I aimed at that cat, I'd hit the rose pole, thought William. Couldn't do it any harm. It looks a jolly strong rose pole. He took careful aim at Hector and fired. After his chastening experience of the morning, he was prepared to miss the rose pole. What he was not prepared for was to see Hector leap 2 feet in the air, descend to the earth, and lie still.
Gosh,
said William, aghast. Trembling with apprehension, he approached his old foe and examined him. There was no doubt of it. Hector's troubles were over. William's, it seemed, were just beginning. The first thing to do, of course, was to dispose of the body. William looked around guiltily. There seemed to be no witnesses of the crime. Bundling Hector under his coat, he scrambled over the fence, concealed Hector in the pile of leaf mould at the bottom of the garden, and went indoors to lunch. "You look rather pale, dear," said Mrs. Brown solicitously. "Do you feel quite well?" William assured her that he did feel quite well, and in spite of the weight on his mind, proceeded to prove it by disposing of 3 large helpings of shepherd's pie and 3 large baked apples with custard. "Did you have a good morning's sport with your gun?" asked Mrs. Brown cheerfully. William gave a bitter laugh.
"Oh, yes, a jolly good morning sport,"
he said. Immediately after lunch he made his way down to the heap of leaf mould and disinterred Hector. Impossible, of course, to leave him there. If he did, the gardener would be certain to start burrowing in the heap first thing tomorrow morning. Impossible for the same reason to bury him anywhere in the garden. With the perversity of fate, that would be the exact spot of the whole garden that the gardener would choose to dig over the next time he came. Jenks's pond in 3-acre meadow was the best solution, but there were drawbacks even to that. It was in full view of the road, and anyone passing and seeing William engaged in this sinister task would remember the fact and later connect it with the disappearance of Hector. Miss Evesham herself might chance to be passing on a bus. Still, the risk must be taken, so William picked up Hector, bundled him again under his coat, and set off for the pond. Even his passage along the road was fraught with danger. Hector was a big cat, and William, though strong and healthy, was not a big boy. Any officious neighbour meeting him might demand to know the nature of the strange excrescence beneath his coat. He was relieved to see that the road was empty, except for a boy about his own age coming from the opposite direction carrying a basket covered with sacking. Even he, however, gave proof of the curiosity that the contours of William's torso were likely to excite. He stopped.
"What have you got under your coat?"
he demanded.
what have you got in your basket?"
countered William, scowling aggressively.
"A cat,"
said the boy.
"Oh,
Said William, taken aback.
a cat, and I'm sick of it.
Added the boy with feeling.
It's heavy as lead. It keeps trying to get out. What is it under your coat?" "A cat, too, and I'm sick of it, too,"
Said William.
"Where are you taking it?"
"To the pond. Where are you taking yours?"
"To the vet, to be put to sleep. It's old Miss Peters, and she's let Honeysuckle Cottage to someone, and she's going up north, and she doesn't want to take the cat with her, and she doesn't think he'd be happy with this person that's coming to Honeysuckle Cottage, and he's getting old anyway, so she's having him put to sleep, and she's only giving me 6pence. Gosh, I'm wore out with it already."
"Let's have a look at it."
Cautiously the boy removed the sacking. William gasped. It was a black cat with a white muzzle, the spit and image of Hector.
"I say,"
he said excitedly.
Will you swap?
How do you mean swap?
Said the boy suspiciously.
Well, mine's dead. It'll save you going to the vet.
Yes, but I've got to take it on to the taxi person in Hadley afterwards. He's going to stuff it for her. She says it's been her only friend for 5 long years, and she wants to have its dear face to look at.
Gosh, she must be bats.
I'll say she is. I've had enough of its dear face and its dear claws in 5 long minutes.
What's its name?
Lucifer. Lucy for short. I say, what are you carrying a dead cat about for?
Never mind that,
said William.
Look here, if we swap, you needn't bother to go to the vet at all. You can just take my cat straight to that man in Hadley to be stuffed. It'll save you a lot of trouble, and they're just alike. She'll never know.
Gosh, they are alike, aren't they?
Yes, and you won't have any trouble with this one. He was something awful when he was alive, but he's all right now.
Very well,
said the boy after a moment's hesitation.
It's her own fault, only giving me 6pence, but...
Quickly, without giving him time to reconsider the matter, William snatched Lucifer from the basket, bundled Hector into it, and with a
cheerio,
set off briskly down the road.
Here, I say,
called the boy, but William, pretending not to hear, climbed the stile into the field and disappeared. Lucifer was inclined to resent this sudden change, but William pinioned him firmly under his coat and carried him towards his new home. As he neared the new home, he slackened his pace somewhat and began to wonder how to introduce him into it. If he just put him down in the garden, he would probably make off at once to his old home. The best thing would be to slip him through a window, close the window, and leave him to it. But as he approached the house, the front door opened, and to his dismay, Miss Evesham came out. She looked pale and anxious.
"William," she said, "I can't think what's happened to Hector. Have you seen him anywhere?"
William opened his coat and brought out Lucifer.
I saw him on the road and brought him along,
he said, with a glow of virtue at the thought that he was only speaking the exact truth.
"Oh, William,"
said Miss Evesham, deeply touched by this unexpected kindness.
"that was very good of you. Bring him in. Poor old Hector. Why did you run away, my precious? He's in a very nervous state, isn't he? I hope he's not been run over or anything."
I think he's all right,
said William. Miss Evesham was anxiously feeling Lucifer's joints.
"Yes, he seems all right. He must have just had a fright. Perhaps some horrible dog chased him, or perhaps he was nearly run over. Here's your tea, Hector, darling."
Lucifer suddenly espied 2 saucers on which his tea was spread, top of the milk bottle on one and 4 sardines on the other, and his nervousness perceptibly diminished. He set to work at once, crouching over the saucers, and only stopping occasionally to purr. Miss Evesham watched him fondly.
"You're all right now, aren't you, darling?"
she said. Evidently he was. Gorged with cream and sardines, he staggered to the nearest chair, flopped down into it, and went sound asleep.
"That's my Hector,"
said Miss Evesham, little knowing how far from the truth this simple statement was. William crept quietly away. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. The next afternoon, Miss Evesham's face, wearing a woe-begone expression, appeared suddenly over the fence.
"William,"
she said.
"he's gone again."
William was annoyed. He was trying to think out a plan for ejecting Miss Evesham from her house, and he didn't want to be interrupted.
Has he?
He said coldly.
"Yes, I want you to take me to the place where you found him before."
It's just on the road, I told you,
said William.
"But, William, please come with me and show me exactly."
The sight of Miss Evesham humble and suppliant went to William's head. Never before had that face appeared over the fence except in frowning displeasure.
"Oh, right,"
he said, with the air of one reluctantly conceding a favour.
"I'll come."
He led her across the field to the point in the road where he had met the boy with the basket.
"I met him just here."
He said.
Coming from that direction?
Said Miss Evesham.
"Yes."
Said William.
Let's go along the road a little further.
Said Miss Evesham.
We may find him.
And they found him. He was sitting on the doorstep of Honeysuckle Cottage, calmly washing his face. On seeing them, he stood up and went indoors, tail erect. Miss Evesham hovered irresolute in the open doorway.
Hector!
She called pleadingly in an undertone. There was no answer. Miss Evesham knocked at the door. An old lady came to the door. She had white hair, a nutcracker nose and mouth, and she walked with a stick. In spite of all this, she looked quite a pleasant old lady. Miss Evesham fixed her with a stern, accusing eye.
I've come for my cat,
she said.
"Oh, your cat."
Said the old lady. She looked over her shoulder.
Is he your cat? I didn't know whose he was. He comes and goes. I give him milk when I have any. I'm not really a cat lover. Come in, won't you?
They followed her into the little sitting room where Lucifer was curled up in a chair by the fire. On the table was a typewriter and a jumble of manuscript.
My name's Miss Perrott,
said the old lady.
and I've come here to do a little writing in peace and quiet. I'm afraid the cottage is damp, though, because my rheumatism is much worse since I came here.
My name's Miss Evesham,
said Miss Evesham, unsmiling.
and I'll take my cat now, if I may.
Certainly, certainly,
said Miss Perrott, seating herself at the table in front of the typewriter. She smiled faintly as Miss Evesham approached Lucifer.
He doesn't seem to know you very well, does he?
Miss Evesham looked at her darkly.
He did before he came here.
The old lady smiled again.
Really?
She said. Miss Evesham set off for home with Lucifer in her arms and a deep frown on her brow.
I didn't like her.
She said to William.
Not from the minute she answered the door. I didn't. She'd got witch written all over her.
"There aren't any witches nowadays,"
said William. Miss Evesham gave a snort.
People think there aren't, she said, but it's a subject I happen to be interested in. I read a book on witches just before I came here, proving that they're still about and just as powerful as ever they were. And a sister of mine once stayed in a village in Cornwall where there was a woman who could ill-wish anyone she liked. Didn't you smell evil in the atmosphere as soon as she came to the door?
William said that he thought he'd smelt gingerbread, but that was all.
And what's she doing? Luring my cat from me,
continued Miss Evesham earnestly.
That's where he must have been that first afternoon when you found him. Never wandered before in all his life, and then suddenly starts going to her cottage. He'd never go on his own accord. She must have put a spell on him.
"Why should she?"
demanded William.
They've got to have cats, haven't they?
Said Miss Evesham.
Perhaps she couldn't bring hers, and that's why she's trying to get mine. Perhaps they have to be black with just that white spot. I don't know. But she shan't have my Hector. I'll save you from her, my precious.
Her precious confronted again with cream and sardines, ate with every appearance of enjoyment, and again went to sleep on the chair. His mistress watched him with anxious affection. William returned slowly and thoughtfully to his own garden. He had discovered the weak spot in his enemy's armour. He must now try to devise some way of using it. As far as the Browns were concerned, Lucifer was an improvement on Hector. He did not trespass in their garden, and he had no taste for birds. He divided his time between his old home and his new, drawn to the old by the force of association, and to the new by top of the bottle and sardines. Miss Evesham seemed to have quite forgotten her feud with William, and regarded him as her friend and ally. "William," she said one morning, meeting him in the village, "he's gone off to that witch again."
I don't think she's a witch,
said William mildly.
"How does she manage to lure him to her cottage like that if she's not put a spell on him? He goes as if something drew him there. And it's not only that. His whole nature's changed. He's not the same cat as he was before she put this spell on him. Everything about him's different. His ways are different. Even his purr seems to have a different note. And he's lost all his affection for me."
it'll come back.
William assured her.
"It's not so much the cat, William,"
said Miss Evesham, lowering her voice,
"as what it stands for. I've always been interested in the subject, as I told you, and I've read a lot about it. I know that witchcraft still goes on, chiefly in small, out-of-the-way villages like this. Casual visitors, of course, never see it. It goes on beneath the surface of normal, uneventful village life. I read a story once about a village like this, quite an ordinary village on the surface, and in the daytime everyone peacefully pursuing their occupation, but at night the whole village would meet secretly and indulge in orgies of witchcraft. I haven't a suspicious nature, William, but if everything is as it seems to be in this village, why is that woman here? And why is she putting a spell on my cat? There's some reason behind it."
William saw a dim light very far ahead. It wasn't bright enough to be called an idea, but it might lead to one.
"It's funny you should say that,"
he said slowly.
"What, William?"
"about the village and witchcraft and that sort of thing. Lots of things have been happening here that I couldn't quite understand."
"What sort of things?"
said Miss Evesham eagerly.
"I don't think I'd better talk about them,"
said William, giving a convincing performance of nervousness.
"I might get into trouble."
"Oh, but you can to me, William. I won't tell a soul. I'll do my best to put a stop to it, but I won't betray you."
"Well,"
said William, as if the confidence were being dragged out of him against his will,
"there have been some funny goings-on here, meetings and things in the village hall after dark. Everyone went to them. They were supposed to be just ordinary meetings with speakers, but, well, there was something funny about them, and I've often wondered what really happened at them."
"Did your father and mother go to them?"
"Oh, yes. After I was in bed, I once got up to look out of the window, and it was moonlight, and the road was full of people going to one of these meetings, and they all had a funny sort of look."
Miss Evesham shuddered.
"How horrible! That's just as it was described in the story I told you of. Something must be done, you know. I don't suppose you realize that these orgies sometimes entail human sacrifice?"
"Yes,"
admitted William.
"and people have disappeared. Not people who live here, but people who were just staying here."
He looked at her hopefully, but evidently the hint of this danger was not sufficient to make Miss Evesham vacate the commodious premises in which she was now so snugly ensconced.
"It's too terrible to think of,"
she said.
"Now, William, I want you to help me. You're only a child, but I can see you're not yet tainted by the poison. I want you to report to me anything suspicious you may see or hear. I realize, of course, that I run a certain risk by staying here at the heart of all this evil and working against it, but I was never one to be turned from duty by danger."
"Well, there's another thing,"
said William with a burst of inspiration.
My father's got a book with laws of banking on the outside, but I think there's something quite different inside. Once I got hold of it and he shouted, "Leave that alone."
Can you get the book, William, and bring it to me?
Afraid I can't. He'd miss it at once, and he's a very savage man.
I'm sure he is. This sort of thing has a very brutalizing effect on the character. But perhaps you could just peep into it when no one's looking and tell me what you see.
Fate seemed to be on William's side, for the next time that Miss Evesham went in search of the errant Lucifer,
It happened to be a very misty morning, and it happened, too, that Miss Perrott was having her chimney swept. Through the mist, Miss Evesham just saw the end of a brush vanishing down the chimney. She turned pale and fled back to the shelter of her own home. Lucifer's arrival a few minutes later, his coat bearing distinct traces of soot, confirmed her worst suspicions.
People laugh at these old ideas of the witch flying through the air on her broomstick,
she said to William.
but they're not invented. They're traditions handed down from the days when such things were openly done and accepted. Now they're only done in secret, but the ritual is the same. Have you been able to look at that book of your father's yet, William?
Not yet,
said William. He was feeling a little troubled. His plan had seemed at first a brilliant one, but it was defeating its own ends. Instead of frightening Miss Evesham away from the neighbourhood, it was making her more determined than ever to stay and investigate the mare's nest, which he'd been at such pains to provide for her. He was frequently sent to Honeysuckle Cottage to bring back the errant Lucifer, and had struck up a friendship with Miss Perrott. He liked her. She was vague and friendly and inconsequent, gave him any sweets or biscuits she happened to have, and encouraged him to talk to her. Visiting her one afternoon, he was considerably startled to find the stuffed figure of Hector standing in a lifelike attitude on her table.
"Oh, the wretched owner of the cottage has sent it down,"
she explained.
"It evidently belonged to her and died, and she's had it stuffed and asked me to keep it safe for her as she's paying a series of visits, and it's an awkward thing to travel about with. I'm sure it is. It's not unlike that horrible cat that keeps coming here, is it? But all cats are the same. I dislike them intensely. They're so feline, though I suppose one can't justly blame them for that. I'll put the ghastly thing away somewhere when I can't see it."
She bundled Hector unceremoniously into a large cupboard and closed the door.
"Now, William, I wonder if you'd do something for me. I want to get up an anti-vivisection meeting while I'm here. I'm not very keen on causes as a whole, but I really have that very much at heart. No one seems to have done anything to arouse interest in it here, so I thought I'd start the good work. Do people come to meetings here?" "Oh, yes,"
said William.
"They like 'em. There's nothing much else to do." "Well, then, if I type the notices, will you take them round for me? I'd be most grateful if you would."
William agreed and went home thoughtfully. He felt that this should be his opportunity of speeding up the plan that was so lamentably hanging fire, if only he could see how to do it. He put in a bit of spade work by calling on Miss Evesham and saying in the conspiratorial whisper they used in discussing the question,
"I've found out what Hector's witch name is."
Which name?
said Miss Evesham, perplexed.
"Yes, they give 'em a different name when they've taught them to do witch work. They call Hector Lucifer."
Miss Evesham paled and looked at the lawn where Lucifer lay enjoying the sunshine.
"Call him by it. See what he does," suggested William.
Lucifer!
called Miss Evesham nervously. Lucifer sprang up and ran to her, rubbing himself against her legs.
"Oh, my poor Hector!"
she moaned.
"What have they done to you?"
All this, however,
Didn't seem to be getting William any nearer his aim, which was the removal of Miss Evesham from the house she so wrongfully occupied. He couldn't blame Miss Evesham herself. She was so credulous as to make the whole thing child's play, but he didn't seem to be able to lead her credulity in the right direction. She was full of excitement when she received the notice of the meeting on anti-vivisection.
"It's one of those meetings you told me of, William,"
she said.
"got up by that woman, too. That in itself would be proof if proof were needed. I shall certainly go and see with my own eyes what happens. Do try and look at that book of your father's before the meeting. I believe that each centre has its own ritual handed down through the generations, and of course they all differ in detail."
A gleam came into William's eyes. Faintly in the distance he saw his nebulous plan taking more definite shape. The next day he paid 3 calls. First he went to Miss Perrott's.
"Why don't you have that stuffed cat on the table for your meeting?"
he said.
"I bet people would like it."
"Yes, that's quite an idea,"
said Miss Perrott.
"I love little pussy, you mean. Yes, it might touch some heart's chord. Yes, it's worth trying."
"I'll carry it down for you,"
offered William.
"Thank you. That would be a help. I've so many papers and things, and my rheumatism isn't getting any better."
"And there's one other thing. You know Miss Evesham?"
That stupid woman who comes here for her cat, yes?
"Well, I think she'd give you a lot of money for the Society in Aid of Vivisection."
Anti-vivisection, William, dear.
"Yes, that. But she likes to be important. She'd like to be on the platform."
Well, there's no reason why she shouldn't be. I'll send her a note.
No, not that way,"
said William slowly.
"She was telling me about a meeting she'd been to, and when everyone was there and the meeting was just going to begin, the person on the platform saw her down in the audience and called her up to the platform, and she liked it because everyone heard it and watched her going up the platform. It made her feel sort of important. She gave them quite a lot of money."
Miss Perrott smiled, a smile in which pity and contempt were mingled.
I know the mentality only too well, but I do need money for the funds, so I'll pander to it.
"You'll call her up to the platform just before this meeting in aid of vivisection begins."
Anti-vivisection, dear. Yes, I certainly will.
So far, so good, thought William, but there was still a lot to be done. He next approached Mr. Westonbury. Mr. Westonbury was the self-appointed master of ceremonies of any function in which he found himself. He fussed about and opened windows and closed doors, or closed windows and opened doors, and gave directions to everyone, whether he knew what they ought to be doing or not. He was a sidesman in church, and showed every member of the congregation to his seat, although there was no need to do it, as the same people had sat in the same seats ever since anyone could remember. At concerts he gave out the items. At dances he gave out the dances. At plays he gave out the dramatis personae and scenes. It was torture to him to have no official part in any proceeding. If he hadn't one, he pretended to have one. If he could do nothing else, he stood up in the front of the hall and looked important. He was a tall, thick-set man with beetling eyebrows, a tense expression, and a habit of saying, "Yes, it is."
"Mr. Westonbury,"
said William, accosting him the next morning in the village. Yes, said Mr. Westonbury, as if he could hardly spare the time to say it.
"you know Miss Evesham what's come to live next door to us?
Yes, said Mr. Westonbury.
And you know Miss Perrott what's getting up this meeting in aid of vivisection?"
Empty, my boy, empty. Yes.
"Well, I think Miss Perrott's going to ask Miss Evesham to go up to the platform, and if she does, Miss Evesham wants to go up to the platform, but she doesn't think she can manage the steps. They're a bit steep, you know, and she's afraid of falling. So would you help her up them to the platform?"
Yes,
said Mr. Westonbury, brightening perceptibly.
"But don't say anything to her about it if you see her. She's a bit shy about it, and of course Miss Perrott may not ask her up, but if she does, she'd be very glad if you'd help her up them. She asked me to ask you, and to ask you not to say anything to her about it, because she feels a bit shy about it."
Yes,
said Mr. Westonbury, squaring his shoulders and bending his arms as if to encircle Miss Evesham's far-from-fairy form.
Delighted, of course. I quite understand. Yes, yes, yes.
And he went on his way, his grim face relaxed almost to a smile. For that evening, at any rate, he was saved from obscurity. There was still Miss Evesham to be tackled, the most tricky part of the whole thing. William had the wisdom to wait till she tackled him, and to appear to be reluctant to give his information. She lay in wait for him the next afternoon, and tackled him as soon as he reached the road.
"William," she said, "have you looked at that book of your father's yet?"
Well, yes,
said William.
and it's about witchcraft, but I couldn't understand it. I don't think it would interest you.
"It would, William," said Miss Evesham. "You must tell me every word. It's most important with this meeting coming on."
Well, you know, about those meetings and how they could pretend they were about things like vivisection so as not to arouse suspicions in outsiders, and it sounds so silly.
He ended.
"William, you must tell me everything,"
Persisted Miss Evesham.
Well,
Continued William.
it seemed to be something about a sort of wooden altar with a hypnotised cat on it.
"A what?"
A hypnotised cat.
"How extraordinary!"
That's what I thought.
Said William.
That's why I thought it was too silly to tell you.
"What else did it say?"
Asked Miss Evesham excitedly.
"Did it say anything about human sacrifice?"
Yes,
Said William.
it seemed to be something about a priestess standing behind this wooden altar with this hypnotised cat on it, and that the human sacrifice must be the person this cat belongs to. And then I heard my father coming in and had to put the book back.
"I shall be there," said Miss Evesham firmly. "I shall sit right at the front so that I can see everything that happens. I shall watch so carefully that nothing can escape me. And then, even at the peril of my life, I shall expose the whole diabolical business."
As the day of the meeting drew near, William became more and more anxious. His calculations depended largely on chance, and chance, as he'd learned from experience, was not always to be depended on. The village turned out in force for the meeting, less owing to any strong local interest in anti-vivisection than to a dearth of rival attractions. Miss Evesham entered the hall wearing a grim, set look, casting challenging glances at the faces around her. Most of the faces wore a bored expression, for though their owners had come for want of something better to do, they cherished no great hopes of the evening. "How satanic they all look," thought Miss Evesham with a shudder as she made her way to the front row. The curtains dividing the platform from the hall were drawn, for no other reason than that Mr. Westonbury enjoyed drawing them back. The clock struck 8, and Mr. Westonbury, with his own inimitable air of providing the most important item of the evening's entertainment, drew them back. Miss Evesham gave a gasp of horror, for there, on the platform, was the wooden table, the altar, she supposed, and on it was Hector. Her Hector, whom she had left asleep by the fire, now spirited here by some infernal means and standing motionless, not moving a muscle or twitching a whisker, hypnotized. And behind the altar was Miss Perrott, looking more witch-like than ever, hatless, her white hair falling about her face, wearing a long black coat and leaning on a stick. Then came the culmination of the horror, for the witch hobbled to the edge of the platform, looked down into the well of the hall, fixed her gimlet eye on Miss Evesham, and said in a voice that froze the blood in Miss Evesham's veins, "Will you come up onto the platform, Miss Evesham?" Too late did Miss Evesham realize the implication of William's words.
The human sacrifice must be the person the hypnotized cat belongs to.
Before she could collect her senses, a bestial-looking man with gorilla-like arms leapt to her and seized her roughly. for Mr. Westonbury had been tormented all evening by a fear that someone might forestall him in performing the friendly office. Here Miss Evesham's paralysis left her. With a piercing scream, she pushed him aside and, turning, fought her way through the crowd to the door. It seemed to her that each member of the audience did his best to bar her progress, but endowed with superhuman strength, as she said when describing the affair afterwards, she fought her way to safety. Once outside, she did not stop to look back, but fled as if 100 devils were at her heels. Miss Perrott watched the scene with raised eyebrows.
A most extraordinary performance, and one best ignored. She had thought for some time that the woman was mental, hanging about her cottage and scowling at her whenever they met.
"Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "the subject on which I am going to speak to you is one which, whether you realize it or not, is of vital importance to you all."
It was William alone who witnessed the next stage in the drama. Miss Perrott felt a little worried after the meeting. The woman was evidently in the throes of a serious nervous breakdown. It would be only right and neighbourly to call on the way home and ask how she was. So William, looking out of his bedroom window, saw Miss Perrott in her long black coat, with Hector under her arm, opening the gate of Miss Evesham's garden. The moonlight lent her a sinister air, accentuating her witch-like appearance and giving Hector's eyes a green and wicked light. But even William was not prepared for what happened next. Miss Evesham's window was thrown open, and Miss Evesham's voice, raised to a shrill scream, rent the silence of the night.
"Get out, you she-devil!"
Some heavy object was hurled at Miss Perrott. It missed her, but caused her unceremoniously to abandon her neighbourly intentions and make her way homeward as quickly as she could. Early next morning, a taxi drew up at the door of Miss Evesham's house, into which Miss Evesham and her belongings hastily transferred themselves. Later in the day, a furniture van drew up and removed Miss Evesham's furniture. Later still, William sat down to write to Joan. He had meant to give her a full account of what had happened, but it was a long and complicated story, and William was, at best, a poor letter writer.
"Dear Joan,"
he wrote,
"it's all right. You can come back now. Love from William." "They're coming for 4 days,"
said Ginger.
"They're city children. They've never seen a cow or anything like that." "Well, there's not much to see in a cow,"
said William judicially.
"I'd soon not see one as see one. You can't have any fun with a cow. I've tried." "Well, they've not seen fields or woods either, only streets and such like." "Well, it's jolly hard lines,"
admitted William.
"Where did you say they were coming?" "To Eastbrook Farm. Mrs. Camp's having them. They're sent by some sort of society what pays for poor children to come into the country." "Well, I vote we take 'em round a bit and show 'em woods and cows and things,"
said William.
"Miss Milton's sister's having them to tea the first day,"
put in Henry.
"I heard my mother say so this morning." "Corks!"
said William, aghast.
"Fancy them having to waste an afternoon going to her."
Miss Milton had lent her cottage to her sister for the summer, and though William had not yet met the lady, he had received the discouraging news that she was an almost exact replica of her sister.
"They must be jolly potty to want to go to tea with her." "Well, they don't know what she's like," said Ginger. "They probably think she's going to give them a jolly good time." "A jolly good time?" echoed William in a tone of withering sarcasm. "Her? Not much good time about her. She'll want 'em to sit round while she talks about the weather. They'd be a jolly sight better off where they came from."
The outlaws would probably have devised some plan for the rescue of the children from Miss Milton then and there, had not the news been brought to them that Hubert Lane had some piebald mice for sale at $1 each. They had been bought for him by one of his adoring aunts as a parting present at the end of a visit, and as Hubert did not care for mice, he was offering them for sale. It happened that by little short of a miracle, the outlaws could scrape $1 together. Henry had received threepence recently from his mother for looking after his young sister in the garden for an hour while she and the nurse were busy.
Yes, and it was more worth £3 than 3p,
said Henry darkly.
I was worn out with crawling about with her on my back round and round the lawn. Seems to think I'm a slave instead of a human being.
Douglas had been given threepence by his father for finding a fountain pen that he had lost.
Douglas, who had borrowed the pen and forgotten to return it, found it by the simple process of bringing it down from his bedroom. Ginger had discovered how to pick the lock of his money-box and had taken out the 3 pennies that were its sole occupants. And William had sold a collection of trained caterpillars, vaunted to be of surpassing intelligence to a credulous and wealthy school friend, also for the sum of threepence. They set off light-heartedly down the road to Hubert Lane's house. The feud with the Hubert Laneites was temporarily in abeyance, and the outlaws took for granted that relations were sufficiently stabilized for ordinary commercial purposes. They knocked with resounding confidence at the Lane front door. A maid answered the knock, stared at them morosely, and fetched Hubert. Hubert looked a little apprehensive when he saw the 4 outlaws clustered on the doorstep.
What do you want?
He said. William held out the 12 pennies in a hot, grubby hand.
Can we have one of your mice, please?
A slow smile spread over Hubert's face. Here was a blessed opportunity to thwart his hated foes. Moreover, he was on his own ground, and no harm could come to him.
No, you can't.
He said.
But someone said you were selling them.
Said William indignantly.
Yes, I am,
Said Hubert.
but not to you.
The outlaws stared at him in amazement.
But we got $1,
Said Ginger. Hubert retreated into the hall so as to be well under the protection of his own roof-tree.
Don't care if you've got 10 shillings.
He said.
Do you think I'd sell one of my piebald mice to you?
You're not going to have one of my piebald mice, and I'm jolly glad you want one of them, so you can't have it, see? Yeah.
William stepped forward instinctively to accept this challenge, but Hubert vanished into the drawing-room, and almost at once Mrs. Lane appeared in his place, looking so fierce that the outlaws instinctively turned tail and fled down the road. Derisive shouts from Hubert followed them.
Think I'd let you have one of my piebald mice? I'd let anyone on earth have them except you. I'd give them away rather than let you buy them. Yeah.
The outlaws walked on, hot with anger and humiliation.
Well, I like that,
Exploded William.
I jolly well like that. We got $1, same as anyone else. He said he was selling them for $1. I bet it's against the law not to sell a thing you said you were selling.
I bet it is.
Agreed Ginger.
Anyway, we don't want his rotten old piebald mice. No, we jolly well don't want his rotten old piebald mice.
Agreed the others.
But they were disappointed and humiliated nonetheless. They did want a piebald mouse, and even more than the loss of that was their public humiliation at the hands of their foe.
He'll tell everyone, said Henry morosely. He'll tell everyone we came and asked for one, and he wouldn't sell us one.
Let's get someone to buy it for us, then he won't know it's us buying it,
suggested Douglas. But this scheme did not appeal to William's proud spirit.
No, that's not the same thing. The thing is to make him sell us one.
We might get into his house somehow,
suggested Ginger.
and pinch one of them and leave $1 in its place.
No, that wouldn't do, said William. He's got to sell us one, and everyone's got to know he sold it to us.
How are you going to make him?
Demanded Ginger.
I don't know yet,
said William. He cogitated the problem at intervals during the rest of the day without arriving at any decision, and the next morning the news of the arrival of the two strange children at Eastbrook Farm drove the whole question out of his mind. The outlaws went over to the farm immediately on receiving the news in order to inspect the newcomers. They found two boys standing by the farm gate, wearing grey shorts and grey jerseys, with large blue and white badges. They looked very clean and very bored. Greetings were exchanged, cautious and a little defiant on both sides. The newcomers, it turned out, were called Bert and Sid. They were 10 and 11 years old. No, they didn't think much of the country so far. A goat had butted them, and a gander had chased them. They were obviously disillusioned and homesick.
You come along with us,
suggested William.
and we'll show you some of our places.
Bert and Sid brightened. Mr. and Mrs. Camp were well-meaning, but preoccupied. The prospect of playmates of their own age was enlivening. They felt less oppressively like strangers in a strange land.
Don't mind if we do,
agreed Bert cautiously. Bert was the older and obviously the leading spirit. He had a slight cast in one eye, and that lent him a somewhat sardonic aspect, and a more than slight suggestion of adenoids. Sid was small and gingery, and obviously ready to follow Bert's lead unquestioningly wherever it took him.
Don't mind if we do,
he repeated. They accompanied the outlaws to the main road and across the fields to the woods. They were at first inclined to be aggressive and to belittle such aspects of the countryside as the outlaws pointed out to them, but their hostility soon melted in the warmth of the outlaws' friendliness. The outlaws, on their side, felt as it were on their mettle to prove the superiority of their own surroundings to those from which Bert and Sid had come, and soon the 6 of them were happily engaged in a rough-and-tumble game in the wood. Bert and Sid were quick to enter into the spirit of it and proved themselves a sufficiently sporting couple. Next, they went to the old barn, made a fire, and cooked one of the outlaws' famous extempore meals, consisting of oddments purloined from their household's larders. In this case, a sardine, a piece of sponge cake, a cold sausage, a tinned apricot, a handful of cold porridge, and a pennyworth of sherbet. This was well mixed together, generously laced with licorice water, and heated in the treasured saucepan that Ginger's mother's cook had given him when it became unfit for household use. Bert and Sid ate their share manfully and pronounced it excellent. They contributed their part, too, to the general entertainment. They were members of a street gang at home, and had stories of adventure to relate that made even the outlaws, seasoned daredevils as they were, hold their breath with excitement. They displayed, too, as they thawed, a dry and caustic wit that delighted their hosts. The 6 returned to the farm, firm friends.
Tell you what we'll do this afternoon,
said William.
We'll go over to Marley. There's some caves there, and we can play smugglers.
The faces of Bert and Sid had lightened at the suggestion, but suddenly they clouded over as a memory occurred to them.
Cool,
said Bert regretfully.
I don't half wish we could, but we can't. We've got to go to tea somewhere this afternoon. A Miss Milton or something,
supplemented Sid.
You'll have a jolly dull time there,
William prophesied.
She's awful. She won't even give you a decent tea if she's anything like her sister,
said Ginger.
She's worse than her sister,
said Douglas gloomily.
I've seen her. Fancy having to waste an afternoon on her,
said William sympathetically.
I bet we could get you a jolly good tea, come to that, said Ginger. Our cook's made gingerbread this morning, and I bet she'd let me have some for you. And I bet I could get some of our ice cake, said Henry. It's orange icing and it's jolly good. Yes, but Mrs. Camp will make us go, I expect,
said Bert.
And old Miss whatever she's called will come and fetch us if we don't,
put in Sid gloomily.
Suppose she will, said Ginger, but it seems a jolly shame. The whole bloomin' afternoon,
groaned Bert.
out of only 4 bloomin' days,
added Sid. Their eyes turned to William. On William's face was a faraway look that was well known to the outlaws. It was obvious that one of his ideas was slowly dawning on the horizon of his mind.
I say,
he began.
Well, said the others expectantly, suppose 2 of us pretend to be Bert and Sid and go to tea to old Miss Milton's instead of them. It doesn't matter much for us, because we can go to Marley Caves any day, but they've only got 4 days, and it might rain on the others.
For a moment their expressions brightened, then gloom closed over them again.
She's seen me already,
said Ginger.
I met her when I was out with my mother yesterday.
A look of disgust came over his face at the memory as he continued.
She said she hoped I liked school and was working hard at my lessons. She's seen me too,
said Douglas.
She came to our house yesterday, and every time I said a word, she said that little boys ought to be seen and not heard. And she's seen me too,
said Henry.
I was just walking past her house, whistling to myself, sort of hitting the hedge with a stick without thinking, and she came up mad as mad and said if I did it again, she'd tell the police.
The faces of Bert and Sid fell at this recital.
Crikey,
said Bert.
It's going to be a blooming fine tea party. Not half,
agreed Sid bitterly.
But she's not seen me,
said William.
Tell you what, I'll say I'm Bert, and that Sid's got a cold or something, and then you can all go off to Marley Caves, and I'll go and have tea with her, and she'll never know it's not you, and you won't have wasted all that time on her. Cool,
said Bert.
That's jolly decent of you. Not half,
agreed Sid. The others looked a little doubtful.
Are you sure she's not seen you?
said Ginger.
I bet you can't keep it up,
said Douglas.
You'll only make a mess of it,
prophesied Henry.
Course I'm sure she's not seen me,
said William impatiently.
And anyway, I'll make myself look different, same as actors and detectives do. They wear beards,
said Ginger.
You can't wear a beard. I'm not going to wear a beard,
said William testily.
I'm just going to make my face different. That's all they do. They just make their faces different. Don't see how you could make yours look different,
said Ginger, looking critically at that uncompromising member.
What do you mean by that?
challenged William.
Nothing, said Ginger pacifically. I didn't say there was anything wrong with it. I only said you couldn't make it different. I bet I can,
said William.
I can pull better faces than you anyway. Yes, but can you keep a face pulled for hours and hours and hours and drink and eat with it pulled? Not even you could. You're only a human being, same as anybody else. Oh, go on,
said William sarcastically.
Go on making objections. I tell you, you've always got to take a risk in an adventure. It's not an adventure if you don't take a risk in it. Well, my face is my risk, and I bet I can take it all right. We're dressed different too,
said Bert, looking from his jersey to William's coat.
Well, we can change, can't we?
said William serenely, for opposition was having its usual effect of hardening his purpose.
You all go on making objections and objections and objections to every little thing. What would people in history have done if they'd all been like you? There'd be no one to follow all those great generals, same as Magna Carta and such like. Well, we aren't in history,
said Douglas, ignoring the doubtful historical allusion.
No, but I've always wanted to be,
said William.
I bet I'd been as good as anyone there. I bet I'd have managed to blow up that old Crystal Palace better than Guy Fawkes did. It wasn't the Crystal Palace,
said Henry.
Oh, shut up,
cried the exasperated William.
I'm sick of talking and talking and talking.
He turned to Bert.
Would you rather go to tea to Miss Milton or to Marley Caves? Me? Crikey, said Bert. Marley Caves, of course. Not half,
agreed Sid.
Right then,
said William in a businesslike voice.
we'll all meet at the old barn, and you and me'll change clothes, and you can go to Marley Caves. Good egg,
cried Bert and Sid simultaneously. William walked slowly and purposefully towards Miss Milton's house, intent upon the manipulation of his face. He was representing Bert's slight cast by his best squint, a squint brought to perfection by years of practice. He did it by opening his eyes to their fullest extent, then fixing them on the end of his nose. Bert's suggestion of adenoids he represented by opening his mouth loosely to the size of a ping-pong ball. In order to further disguise himself, he had damped his hair and brushed it into a straight fringe just above his eyes, and he was walking with a curious, stooping, shambling gait, letting his hands dangle about his knees. It was not surprising that a nervous and elderly lady who had just got off the bus, having come from a considerable distance in order to inspect the brasses in the church, should, after one startled glance at him, get back on the bus and go home again. Even Miss Milton, redoubtable warrior as she was, blenched slightly as she saw the figure that was shambling slowly up to her front door. William, aware of her scrutiny from the drawing-room window, intensified the squint, opened his mouth yet further, and dangled his hands more violently. Miss Milton herself came to the door.
please, mum,
began William in a deep, throaty voice before she could speak. Bert had handed on to him all Mrs. Camp's directions as to behaviour. Mind you call her mum now, and be respectful.
Please, mum, I'm Bert, and Sid couldn't come. He got a bad cold.
He opened his eyes to their utmost capacity and fixed them with all his might on the end of his nose. He was finding his squint useful. It saved him from the necessity of meeting Miss Milton's eye.
I'm sorry to hear that,
said Miss Milton, conscientiously trying to overcome the distaste that his appearance inspired in her.
Come in, dear boy. Wipe your feet well on the mat, and then come into the drawing-room.
William followed her into the drawing-room and sat down on a small chair by the window. One of Mrs. Camp's admonitions had been, "Don't speak till you're spoken to." William found this advice useful, as the upkeep of squint and ping-pong ball mouth demanded his full attention. Miss Milton looked at him, blinked, looked away, then, summoning all her courage, looked at him again.
Are you enjoying your holiday in the country?
She said.
Yes, mum,
said William in a deep, throaty voice.
I suppose you've never been in the country before, have you?
No, mum.
It must be a delightful experience for you.
Yes, mum.
I suppose that badge is the badge of the society that sends you out into the country like this.
Yes, mum,
said William without removing his squint to look at it.
I hope you realise that you're a very lucky boy.
Yes, mum.
Miss Milton tried to think of something else to say, but failed.
Perhaps,
she said at last,
you'd like to come out and see the garden, would you?
Yes, mum,
said William. He followed her out into the little garden.
It's my sister's garden, really, of course,
said Miss Milton.
And she likes to keep it tidy, so don't go on to the grass. There's plenty of room for you to walk on the path.
William was tired of saying, "Yes, mum." He was artist enough to want to make more of his part than that.
Grass, mum,
he said in his deep, throaty voice.
What's grass?
Miss Milton was taken aback for a moment. Surely even city children knew what grass was, but evidently they didn't, so she hastened to explain.
That's grass,
she said, pointing to her sister's sparse little lawn.
It's, well, it's just grass,
she ended lamely. William began to feel that a certain amount of enjoyment might, after all, be extracted from the situation. He pointed over the hedge to a cow that was pleasantly ruminating in the next field.
What's that?
He gruffed.
That's a cow.
What's a cow?
Miss Milton sighed. But of course it was quite natural that a city child should never have seen a cow.
"It's just a cow, dear," she said. "A cow is, well, it's a cow."
Miss Milton's cat sauntered out of the kitchen door and eyed William sardonically.
What's that?
He said, pointing at it.
"A cat, of course," said Miss Milton rather sharply. "Surely you've seen cats at home?"
William realized that he was rather overdoing his town-bred ignorance.
It's bigger than town cats,
he said hastily.
"I suppose it is,"
said Miss Milton, appeased. The cat, who had recognized William, winked at him and went indoors again. Miss Milton told him the names of the various flowers as they went round the garden.
"That's a viola, dear, and that's a campanula, and that's an antirrhinum."
William thought wistfully of Marley Caves and wished he was there with the others.
"And now, dear,"
said Miss Milton, ending her recital,
"it's time we went in to tea."
William resisted the temptation to say,
What's tea?
and instead pointed to a thrush that was sitting on the top of a hedge and said,
What's that?
"A thrush, dear,"
said Miss Milton, trying to be patient.
What's a thrush?
Said William.
"Just a bird, like any other bird. You've surely seen birds before. Our little feathered friends who sing."
Why?
Said William, who thought that Miss Milton might at any rate pay for the boredom she was inflicting on him.
"What do you mean, why?"
Why do they sing?
"Well, why does anyone sing?"
Countered Miss Milton.
Well, why do they?
Said William.
"Because they... Well, really, my dear boy, that is a very silly question. They just sing. It's a God-given gift."
Same as cats and donkeys.
"No, those haven't nice voices at all."
Who gives them then?
Inquired William. Miss Milton pretended not to hear.
"Now, tea, dear,"
she said brightly, leading the way into the dining room. It was, as Ginger had prophesied, a rotten tea. There was a small plate of sparsely buttered bread, a plate of plain, unbuttered buns, and a few stale Amari biscuits. William soon emptied the plates, but Miss Milton did not have them refilled.
"I'm glad you've made such a good tea,"
she said. She looked at him with shrinking interest.
"I suppose you've seen an oculist about your squint?"
Yes.
Said William, hastily doing it again. He'd been forgetting it since he started his tea.
He said there was no cure.
"It seems to come and go in such an odd way,"
went on Miss Milton, fascinated and repelled by the phenomenon.
Yes,
Agreed William.
he said that sort couldn't ever be cured.
"Really? Of course," she admitted. "I don't know much about the subject. It's very bad just now, isn't it?"
As William did a particularly ferocious one.
Yes,
Agreed William, and added hopefully,
it comes on worst when I'm hungry.
"But you've just had your tea,"
said Miss Milton. William made no comment on this.
"Well, just stay here a moment," went on Miss Milton. "I'll try and get a little companion of your own age. You'd like that, wouldn't you?"
William grunted noncommittally, and she went into the hall. He followed her to the door to listen. She was telephoning to Mrs. Lane.
"I've got one of those children from Eastbrook Farm to tea, and he's absolutely hopeless. A dreadful squint and almost mental. I wondered if your dear little Hubert would come along and give me a hand with entertaining him. You'll send him round at once? Oh, how kind of you. We'll expect him in a few minutes, then."
She returned to William, who'd gone back to his chair and assumed his most devastating squint.
"A very nice and well-behaved little boy, I know, is coming round to see you. But," she said, "I don't approve of rough games, but there isn't any reason why he shouldn't take you for a nice, quiet walk down the road and show you some cows and things."
William squinted at her in wild desperation.
I think perhaps I'd better be going home now,
he said.
Oh, but Mrs. Camp said you needn't go till 6,
objected Miss Milton.
Yes, but...
With sudden inspiration.
But what with Sid ill, I think perhaps I'd better be getting back.
If there's any real cause for anxiety,
said Miss Milton.
I'll come along with you and see how he is.
Oh, no,
said William hastily.
no, it's not as bad as that.
Well then, dear, I think it would do you good to meet this little boy who's coming. He's a very nice boy, and it would be a privilege for you to know him. As I said, he can take you a little walk and show you the country, birds and things.
William was on the point of inventing a sudden illness of his own when he saw Hubert entering the garden gate. Escape was now impossible. He sat there, intensifying his squint and opening his mouth to the size of a cricket ball. Miss Milton went to the door and returned, followed by Hubert. Hubert looked at William, and recognition leapt into his eyes and then died away again. The boy had looked like William Brown at first sight, but on further inspection he obviously wasn't. His clothes were different, his hair was different, his mouth was different, his eyes were different.
This is Bert,
Miss Milton introduced him.
and this Bert is Hubert. Now, Hubert, I want you to take Bert a nice, quiet walk down the road and show him the country. You'll go with Hubert, won't you, Bert?
Yes, ma'am,
said William in his deep, throaty voice. His voice was different too, thought Hubert.
Come back in a quarter of an hour.
Miss Milton called after them as they set off down the road. As soon as they were out of sight of the house, Hubert gave William a tentative punch, but received such a spirited one in return that he decided to keep relations on a friendly footing.
I say, Bert,
he said.
you're awfully like a boy I know called William Brown. I mean, you are just at first. I could see you weren't him all right when I looked at you properly. But just at first, you looked just like him. He's an awful boy. My mother won't let me play with him. I'd jolly well score one off him today. I'm selling some mice, and he wants one. And I won't sell him one. He's mad as mad.
Hubert sniggered.
I say, I've got a jolly good idea.
They were passing William's house, and William was for hurrying past it with averted face, but Hubert stopped.
Let's play a trick on him. You go in and go round the back and smash the window in the tool shed. You're sure to find a ball or a stick or something lying about to do it with. You look enough like him for anyone who sees you to think you are him. And I heard his father say the next time he broke that window, he wouldn't have any pocket money for a month. That's a jolly good trick, isn't it? Go on, do it quick and then come out. There's no one about. I'll wait for you here. Go on.
William crept round the back of the house, watched by the sniggering Hubert. Then, out of sight, he entered the back door, slipped upstairs, changed into one of his ordinary suits, brushed his hair into its ordinary position, and came out to the front door with his usual sturdy tread, whistling, his hands in his pockets. Hubert, still crouching behind the hedge, anxiously watching the path that led to the back of the house, did not see him till he was almost upon him. Then he paled with horror.
Hello, Hubert,
said William in a tone of well-simulated surprise.
what are you doing here?
Hubert blinked, gasped, and looked wildly at the path down which he had seen Bert disappear.
I say,
He stammered.
there's a boy in your back garden. I was just taking him for a walk, and he ran away from me down into your back garden. I told him not to, but he would. I hope he's not doing any damage. I'll go and have a look for him,
offered William cheerfully, and set off down the path where he'd gone only a few minutes ago in the character of Bert. He returned almost immediately.
There's no one there,
He said.
Who did you say it was? Oh, he must be there,
Cried Hubert desperately.
He only went round a minute ago. Perhaps he's hiding or something. He's a country holiday boy called Bert.
He explained.
He'd gone to tea with Miss Milton, and I was just taking him a nice quiet walk down the road when he suddenly ran in at your gate and down that path. I called out, "Come back," but he went on. I say,
His anxiety conquered his usual discretion.
do you mind if I come round and look for him? No.
Said William pleasantly.
Come on in and have a look. I don't know why he went round to your back garden,
Said Hubert again.
I kept telling him not to.
He peered nervously into the tool shed and the summer house, followed by the grinning William.
He can't have gone anywhere else, can he added distractedly. I don't know what I'm going to do if I don't find him. He might have gone through the hedge into the field, said William helpfully. But if he had done that, we'd have seen him in the field, and he's not there. Of course, he went on with rising cheerfulness. He might have fallen into the rain tub and got drowned.
Hubert's pale face turned green.
Will I get hung for murder if he is? He said. Oh, no, William reassured him. They'd probably let you off with just keeping you in prison for life.
Hubert opened his mouth, and William saw that in another moment his howls would rend the air and bring out the occupants of all the houses near. He hastily peeped into the rain tub.
No, it's all right,
he said.
He's not there.
A slight expression of relief flickered over Hubert's face and then departed, leaving it pallid with anxiety.
But what am I going to do?
He demanded.
I can't go back to Miss Milton without him. And I can't just go home because she'll ring up my mother, and there'll be an awful fuss. They'll say I oughtn't to have let him go, but he just ran round the side of your house quick as quick before I could stop him. Yes, there'll be a fuss all right,
agreed William.
That cow in the field may have ate him. Some cows do, you know. You can never tell with cows. They go on for years and years and years eating grass, and then, quite suddenly, they eat a person. And then they won't do it again for 10 years or so.
But Hubert wasn't listening to him. A sudden wild gleam of hope had come into his eye.
I say, William,
he said eagerly,
you will help me, won't you? I've got an idea. This boy was a bit like you, just a bit. If you could sort of cross your eyes and hang your mouth open a bit and walk sort of doubled up, they might think it was him. I bet Miss Milton's jolly short-sighted. People like her always are. But what about clothes?
said William.
Had he a suit like this on?
Hubert's face fell.
No, he hadn't, but...
It lit up again.
You could put your raincoat on, and I could say that it looked like rain, so I called the farm for your raincoat, and she won't notice you'd not got the same things underneath.
William considered, and a light beamed suddenly in his eye, too. At first he had meant merely to give Hubert a fright, in order to pay him out for his mean trick in the matter of the tool-house window. But now it occurred to him that more might be made of the situation than that.
All right, he said. I will if you'll sell me one of your piebald mice.
Hubert hesitated. He had widely advertised his refusal to sell the mouse to William, and he would lose considerable face if he did so. But the crisis was an urgent one, so with a sigh, he agreed.
Very well,
he said. William put his hand in his pocket and drew out a shilling.
Here's the money,
he said.
You go and fetch it now, and I'll put on the squint and go with you to old Miss Milton.
A few minutes later, William was hiding his piebald mouse carefully in the wooden box, which had holes bored in its surface for the purpose of ventilation, and which had in its time housed many similar occupants. A layer of straw at the bottom served for bodily comfort, and a dog biscuit lent unwittingly by Jumble for sustenance. That done, William went indoors for his raincoat.
Now, what do you say this boy looked like?
He said in a businesslike tone as he came out, doing up the buttons.
He had his hair brushed different,
said Hubert, looking at him anxiously.
Never mind that,
said William, who didn't want to make himself too much like the mysteriously vanished Bert in case it should arouse Hubert's suspicions.
A bit of hair doesn't make much difference one way or another. Well, he had a sort of squint, same as I told you,
went on Hubert. William did a mild and tentative squint.
What about that?
Yes, said Hubert doubtfully.
That's a bit like it. Well, you can't expect me to turn right into him,
said William, who was beginning to enjoy the situation.
If it's not right, I won't bother to come. Yes, said Hubert eagerly. Do come. I didn't mean that. It's jolly good. What else had he besides a squint?
Said William.
Well, his mouth sort of kept open all the time. I bet I can do that all right,
said William, opening his mouth to about the size of a halfpenny marble.
Yes, said Hubert. I mean, it's jolly good. he added hastily. "Jolly good. It's not quite like him, of course, but I bet she won't notice." "Well, what do you want me to do?" said William. "I've not got much time." "Just come back to her with me," said Hubert, "and say you've had a jolly nice walk with me and that sort of thing, and that it's time you went home now, and then go off down the road as though you were going to Eastbrook Farm, and I'll go the other way to my home, and then if they say this Bert never got home, she can't say it's my fault. I mean, I had brought him back from the walk all right." "Oh, will you?" said William meaningly. "I'll let you have the mouse," Hubert reminded him with humble pleading in his voice. "All right," agreed William, as if reluctantly. "I'll come along." "You needn't start doing his face till you get there," said Hubert. "I don't want you to get wore out before she sees it."
They walked down the road to Miss Milton's house. William preserved a strategic silence. Hubert kept saying, somewhat nervously, that he couldn't think why Bert had suddenly run round William's house like that, nor what had become of him.
"He just started off. I did all I could to stop him. Corks, I hope nothing's happened to him. You did have a good look in the rain tub, didn't you?"
His face grew paler as they approached Miss Milton's.
Go on, he said in a tense undertone as they reached the gate. Do 'em now.
William did his modified squint and opened his mouth slightly. The front door was open, and Miss Milton was telephoning in the hall. She waved them in and went on with her telephoning. She was evidently describing her guest to an acquaintance.
"He's just come in now," she said. "He looks better already, less degraded, if you know what I mean. He had a dreadful cast in his eye when he first came, but even this one day in the open air's improved it. Yes, I'd love you to come and see him. Yes, come straight round. You have a little boy of your own, haven't you? Could he come too?" "Oh, he's out." "Yes, I quite understand. But you'll come, won't you? You must, of course, be prepared for something very different from your own child."
She turned from the telephone to greet them.
"Well, dears,"
She began brightly. Hubert interrupted with a long, nervous account of how they'd called at the farm for Bert's raincoat, and then William, continuing his modified squint, said that it was time he went home. Miss Milton, however, insisted on hearing a detailed account of their walk before he went.
"I suppose it opened a new world to you, didn't it, my boy?"
she said to William. She was so relieved the end of his visit was in sight that she felt almost affectionate towards him. Suddenly she looked out of the window.
"Oh, here's a lady who's kindly coming to see you, Bert," she said. "You must stay just a few minutes longer and speak to her. I'll just go and open the door."
They heard greetings in the hall. Then the door was thrown open, and
"This is Bert,"
said Miss Milton, pointing to him in a proprietary fashion. William squinted wildly and opened his mouth almost to the size of a football, but in vain.
"William,"
said Mrs. Brown.
It's not William.
Protested Hubert vehemently.
Honest, it's not William. He's like William, but he's not William. It's Bert."
"Of course it's William," said Mrs. Brown indignantly. Hubert persisted that it was not William, and Miss Milton supported him. Mrs. Brown said that a woman knew her own son after 11 years. William continued to squint and said nothing.
Then the real Bert, hot and breathless and dirty and gloriously happy, arrived. He'd had a wonderful afternoon at Marley, but on the way home had run into Mrs. Camp, who, discovering that he was wearing another boy's suit, had sent him round to retrieve his jersey. The altercation waxed fast and furious. Hubert and Miss Milton insisted more strongly than ever that Bert was not Bert, and that William was not William. Mrs. Brown said that she knew nothing about Bert. All she knew was that William was William. Everyone talked at once except William. William waited patiently for the hubbub to subside. He'd have to give an account of himself soon enough. No need to precipitate matters. Meantime, he was fixing his thoughts on the one bright spot in the whole situation. And the one bright spot in the whole situation was the piebald mouse. Bert or no Bert, that at any rate was safely his.